Bored at home and nothing on the tube? Out of cereal and smokes? Looking for something to do on a weekend night that won't end with federales knocking at your door? At Vineland Lanes, we have something for everyone. Do you have a predilection towards the violent? Hurl one of our well-weighted spheres down an alley towards defenseless wooden targets and watch the explosion send it all into chaos. We offer a variety of targets to topple, including hippies, corporate scumbags, FBI buzzkills, and so many more. Do you desire moderately priced, mostly edible, borderline yuppie cuisine? Head through the squeakiest stores this side of the San Andreas Fault and into a restaurant that was once called Upscale by a friend of the chef's sister and try our cream of zucchini soup or rearrange one of our vegetarian tostadas across any of our high-end Formica tabletops. When you finish your meal, ask for our food psychics to come to your table and perform a 100% accurate reading of your leftovers. Let our gourmand gazers scry through your fries or divinate what's on your plate and provide you with a guaranteed prophecy. And for just an extra $19.99 American, they'll provide you with the meditative mantra you can use in everyday conversation. Just slip it in and blow someone's mind. Thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Cody.
And I'm Will.
Today we're going to be discussing chapters 3 and 4 of Vineland. We are going to be down a couple of people over the next 3 weeks. We're gonna have a couple of shows where there's only 3 of us. This week, Luke is unfortunately not going to be with us, so it'll just be the 3 of us digging into these chapters, but so much sort of happens over the course of these early setup chapters that we didn't want to delay the discussions as a whole, just to make sure that you guys still have some content to listen to, and so that it's all fresh in our minds, especially as we head into a holiday season where people are probably looking for something to listen to in between awkward dinner conversation at Thanksgiving. So that being said, Will, do you have a summary for chapters 3 and 4?
I believe I do.
Great.
Chapter 3. Our next scene is delayed by an extensive flashback to the first time Zoid had crossed paths with his arch-nemesis Hector. The DEA agent had arrived at the Corvairs group home with a loose wallet full of bills available to any junkie who might have a dime to drop on a supplier. Zoid's own principled stand was slightly undercut when Van Meter accidentally let loose some ultimately useless intel when he mistook Hector for a connect, giving him an opportunity to prove he was good for it with a flourish of a 5. Their relationship blossoms in slow motion before our eyes, with scenes of previous meetups and refusals to buy in set in various locales. They finally meet in real time at the local bowling alley, where Hector does something unspeakable to his tostada. Hector acting his part, he alludes spookily to Prairie before moving on to the real subject for Nessie, her mother. Apparently, she'd been under witness protection, if a lower priority sort, but had disappeared recently. With an earnestness Zoid cannot believe, Hector confides the secrecy of it all, even within the federal agencies. Nobody knows what's going on, but her file's been properly wiped. They briefly revisit old contests, leading Zoid into some good old-fashioned romanticizing of his opponent's distilled essence of cop. He doesn't seem like his old self today. Still, he brings an offer like always. Zoid's to be bait for his ex, so the Federales can at least begin to keep track of her again. This time, Zoid seems to be considering it for a moment at least, but then something seems to agitate the Fed, and he starts to voice some personal injuries that Zoid had made to him via negligence as a friend. They begin to reconcile when the check comes, which is punctuated by the arrival of the National Endowment for Video Education and Rehabilitation Special Operations Unit, here to take Hector back into their custody. Suddenly, his strange theme tune hums and novel additions to his vernacular made sense to Zoid. He was a tube freak, and he was at large. Chapter 4. Thanks to neighborly obligation, Zoid was out of his car. but had in turn borrowed another, a pickup with a camper top. He finally made his way to help a local farm with their interminable tide of crawfish an hour late. He knew one of the owners from a chance meeting at a saloon the night that Frenesi had left, so of course the drive brings back some painful memories. She'd made him feel square. Him! He'd been working as a day laborer and playing bars along the inlands at night, and in a whirlwind they'd been married in the same fields he'd grown up running wild through. The reception was raucous, but in no way wild, and they felt set for their best lives together. Years later, he would still astral project to her present location and pretend she hadn't left. Later that night, unloading on Van, Zoid blames himself as much as her. Meter helpfully pokes fun in the direction of the man Frenesi had chosen. A few people let Zoid know that he'd better watch out. Some Fed had been looking for him, so he drops his dime on Hector with never. Apparently, though, he wasn't the only one. Goosebumps. He shrewdly calls Prairie at work, telling her to ask Isaiah and his bandmates to hang around until he could get there. When he does, after meeting up with a few other old pals, mooching a few bucks off them and getting a few more heads-ups, he finds Hector at the Bodhidharma Pizza Company. He updates the doctors at the rehab and heads in. Hector was telling Prairie what she'd wanted to hear. He'd been talking to Frenesi and was willing to take her to her. This is a line too far for Zoid to tolerate, but the situation is lightly diffused when Hector unveils the name of the other Fed. Brock Vond, the man who took Frenesi away. And more. Wheeler's house was being seized after a search discovered supposed tons of reefer stashed throughout it, and he was to be tried in a civil RICO suit. This is when Hector's illness shows. He's sidetracked from whatever his supposed purpose is, trying to get Zoid and Prairie to sign the contracts for him and a partner to televise the events. Luckily, the rehab doctors parachute in to seize the maniac and protect him from himself. Zoid arranges for her to go along with Isaiah and the band for a while, so he can figure out the real goings-on. This brings some domestic tensions to a head as they try to sleep in the back of the borrowed truck. Prairie hops into the Vomitones van the next day, neither of them at all sure when they'll see each other next.
Okay, so there was a lot to unpack in these second chapters. Certainly significantly more, in my opinion, than was present in the first two. But I just wanted to start with everyone's overall thoughts with the chapter before we dig into the actual material here.
Yeah, I again love what's happening here, and you're absolutely right in that there's a lot more happening in these two chapters. I think the first two chapters, we're kind of getting to know our main characters a little bit more so than diving into the actual plot. So I think it's in these two chapters where we kind of start to lay the groundwork for a lot of the themes and plot points that we're going to see as the story progresses. It's a really good set of chapters. Some of the funniest parts that I remember from this book are in these two chapters, and we'll definitely get into those. But I think it does a really good job, I think, in these, it's like 30 some odd pages, I think, altogether, of setting everything up and kind of really setting the table for what we're in store for as far as, Zoid and his various relationships. We're getting some backstory, between the relationship with him and Hector, and a little bit of detail on Frenesi, and some more of his relationship with Prairie. So I really enjoyed these chapters. I had a really good time reading them. I think, as we talked about in the first episode, this is really, I think, a great example of Pynchon's ability to do more with less. And, even though these are, I don't want to say they're short chapters, because, it's, if you average them out, there's, 15, 16 pages per chapter. But there's so much going on, and it doesn't really feel as confusing or obtuse as some of the other maybe larger works, where you have to do a little bit more work to parse out specifically what's happening on each page. I think this flows a little bit easier. It's a little bit easier to comprehend the goings on, so it makes for not necessarily an easier read, but certainly a very pleasant one.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I think that it's again like we talked about last episode. It's these chapters are a real showcase of Pynchon getting into the emotional aspects of his characters and digging into what makes them people. We had remarked back when we were talking about Crying of Lot 49 about the scene where Oedipa is driving and thinking, and kind of how her thoughts drift in and out as she's taking different freeway exits, and she's going about these different sort of errands that she's running on. And Pynchon certainly does that in chapter 4 again, albeit significantly extended, as Zoid is going about his day, selling the crawfish, and then also, trying to figure out what he's going to do about Hector, and then eventually going and seeing his daughter and all of that. The way that Pynchon slips in and out of Zoid's memories as he's kind of recounting his marriage and his previous life in the Corvairs, and as he's kind of thinking about the different things that have led him to be in the position that he is now. I just loved that whole section of chapter 34, just that, or not 34, chapter 4. Just that whole extended sequence where you get to know his backstory and where his mental state is at, and the different decisions that he's made over his life, and how those two things have kind of weaved together to make him the person that he is. It's such an amazing piece of writing. And like we had talked about last episode in the introduction, in how in a lot of cases, like, the people that Pynchon writes about in his books up to this point didn't feel like real people. They felt like Pynchon characters, certainly, and they felt at home in the world that Pynchon was writing. That is very much not the case, especially in chapter 4. Like, everything that Zoid is remembering and thinking about and kind of breaking down as he's on this sort of one-man odyssey involving multiple cars and different locations and everything is just very true to life, and all of his different observations about his marriage, and especially their wedding and everything that occurred there. I love it. And then, chapter 3, kind of working backwards, I agree. I think that the relationship that is shown between Hector and him is a very similar thing. Like, he's having those memories, and he's remembering kind of his life and what led them to cross paths with one another. And also, you have Hector sort of weirdly attached to him, and talking about how, like, he kind of knows that there was never going to be any chance of him flipping him to becoming a CI, but he couldn't leave this alone. Like, he just wanted it so bad.
Yeah.
And all of the different strange kind of ways that they cross paths. Like, it's so interesting to get to see that spelled out. And yeah, I agree. I think that all of the character work being done, not just from the protagonist side, but also who is currently the antagonist, is just so excellent. And I love the opening paragraph of chapter 3, so I was just going to read that, because the way that Pynchon describes the relationship is just incredible to me. It says here, it was a romance over the years, at least as persistent as Sylvester and Tweedy's. Although Hector may from time to time have wished some cartoon annihilation for Zoid, he understood from early in their acquaintance that Zoid was the chasee he'd be least likely ever to bag. Not that he credited Zoid with anything like moral integrity in resisting him. He put it down instead to stubbornness, plus drug abuse, ongoing mental problems, and a timidity, maybe only a lack of imagination, about the correct scale of any deal in life, drug or non-drug. And though not as obsessed these days about turning Zoid, they'd had that crisis long ago, Hector still, for no reason he could name, liked to keep on popping in every now and then, preferably unannounced. I genuinely think that Vineland contains some of Pynchon's best, most easily digestible writing. There seems to be a particularly strong vocal quality to the book, where having it kind of read aloud, and me and Will kind of mentioned this before the show started, but that's something that we kind of do if we're getting lost, or just if we want to go back and revisit something. There's something just very pleasant about reading a lot of these quotations out, and it almost feels kind of like I wouldn't necessarily say like hearing someone tell you a story in person, but maybe like watching a documentary, or like a talking head segment and something like that. And yeah, I absolutely love it. I'll save any further discussion for later in the show. What did you think, Will?
I don't have much to add to what you both said. I think everything you pointed out are the primary drivers of what I love about these chapters too. It's it's interesting that you point to the relationship between between Zoid and Hector, because these two characters, I think, and that scene in chapter 3 really demonstrate what the reason that I struggle with describing Pynchon's earlier characters as two-dimensional. I think what he excels at is demonstrating how two differing perspectives can align in a certain way. And it's what I love the most out of this chapter 3 is the way that you can see point for point how they disagree on everything, and yet both Hector and Zoid, even if Hector is being a little bit melodramatic, how it does make sense that they would feel a kinship and a connection to one another. And it does feel like, when they're sitting there having their conversation, even though you can sit there and think, well, Zoid means this and Hector understands it this way, you can still understand the thread that both of them are engaging on. And I think it's beautiful. And moving on to chapter 4, it is just an incredible kind of flattening of time. There's a certain kind of person which Pynchon explores more in Inherent Vice. A certain kind of stoner for whom they've lived in the past for so long that it just is the world around them. And I've never seen it portrayed in a way as seamless as in chapter 4 here.
Yeah, definitely. I think anyone who's had a serious relationship, not even necessarily marriage, but just like a very long-term, like serious invested relationship, can certainly relate a lot to the flattening of time element of when you think about that person, when they come back up in your life, whether it's something you are choosing to think about, or in the case of Zoid, rearing its ugly head kind of back into your consciousness, and the way that your brain just kind of plays through all of that in a way that is very particular. And I think Pynchon captures that incredibly well here. I've certainly had moments like that in my life, thinking about old relationships or people that I was very close to, even not necessarily romantically, but even from a friendship standpoint. I'm glad that you brought up Inherent Vice, because that was one of the biggest things that I want to talk about. This work, and I guess probably the California trilogy as a whole, feels very synergistic with one another. I won't bring up the main reason why this is very relevant to Crowning of Lot 49, because we'll get to that at a later point. But there are a lot of aspects to this, like you're talking about, with it being like a particular kind of stoner that is very similar to Doc, obviously. But also there are a lot of direct connections between Inherent Vice, the last book in the California trilogy by publication date, and this book. Both of them have references to Gordita Beach, which of course we don't get as much of the interiority of as we do in Inherent Vice, because that's where Doc lives in Inherent Vice. But also the relationship between Hector and Zoid is kind of a proto relationship for, Doc and Bigfoot. And we also have like the Corvairs mentioned, who Zoid played in, and they are mentioned in Inherent Vice as being part of the kind of scene there near Gordita Beach, and that kind of alternate reality Manhattan Beach that Pynchon is writing about. We talked about it in Mason and Dixon that these books could be in the same universe, to use a very popular, like, modern description. But it's certainly sections like this that certainly add weight to that theory. But even more so, I just wanted to get everyone's thoughts on how these two books seem very enmeshed together, and the kind of thematic thing that Pynchon is driving at in writing a longer book in Vineland about sort of the aftermath of that scene and people straggling after it kind of starts to blow up, and then finally returning to it in Inherent Vice. What are your guys' thoughts about the way these books are connected to one another, and how they seem synergistic in a lot of ways to what they're up to?
I think a large part of not just the California trilogy, but I think of Pynchon's work in general is kind of examining the cyclical nature of not just history, but of like cultural zeitgeists and how they impact society at different times. And we kind of we touched on this in the last episode, but I think a lot of it comes down to how the faults and the failings of the earlier generations lead to the change that inevitably comes up in the later generations. And while those themes are certainly present in Lot 49 and Inherent Vice, I think they're much more explored in here because of the fact that we are jumping between these two time periods, unlike in those other two books where we're really just kind of stuck in that one specific time set. With Vineland, we are seeing how different not just the characters were in the 60s, but how different the time was and how different society was, and how the things that were done and accepted as the norm in one time were not in the other time. And so you're really with this specifically Vineland, you're really getting to see the kind of broader picture and the full impact of how all of that has worked itself out. Whereas with Lot 49 and Inherent Vice, it's kind of hinted at, with Inherent Vice and Lot 49, we see how the kind of burgeoning real estate boom and obsession is starting to make these impacts and ripples here and there, but you don't get to really see what comes of that. It's just kind of implied where it's going to go. Whereas in Vineland, we are seeing the impacts of that kind of hypercapitalism starting up at that time, and how it's starting to get its foothold, and not and also with like the police presence in society, and how it's gone from what it started as in the 60s and what it eventually morphed into in the 80s. And so I think it's really kind of fitting that this book sits in the middle of that trilogy as far as publication date. I think it's good to have those other two kind of bookend it and act as a sort of a pair of I guess what's the word I'm like, I guess warnings of this is the kind of thing that can happen over time, but you really see how it fleshes itself out in the middle. And I am at the point now where I'm starting to like cycle back on my own point, so I will let Will have a word here.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try really hard to not get into my own big crazy theories.
You can get into your own big crazy theory.
Yeah.
It's far too early in the book.
Okay.
But I will say that I think it's very interesting how, if you look at the books chronologically, there's no diegetic chronology, within the storyline of the books, what happens in series. It's all kind of pretty straightforward. Not in terms of, if you read Crying of Lot 49, you can expect what happens in Vineland. But if you are alive today or any point past the 70s and you read the books, you kind of got what the point was in terms of social criticism, broadly. But what's interesting is when you look at that in contrast to the publication date, because it is a depending on your taste, a flaw of all of his early works. But Lot 49 is viewed as kind of comical. We have talked about how this book Vineland is deeply funny and a standout in that regard. But also Lot 49 in general is discussed as kind of a light-hearted book, which I find hilarious.
Yeah, that's not a lighthearted
No, it's
story.
not.
But if you do read it in that way, if you read it as a dissection of tropes and if you look away from the way that he is explicitly telling you to, mirror it onto reality in some ways, and therefore ignore the social criticism, it's funny. It is funny, and a lot of the characters you can read as two-dimensional and just kind of skate across it. And Vineland is hilarious, and it has all this depth of character, but the hilarity is still there in kind of the same way. Inherent Vice is different though. It's really dark. Like it is a comic book in terms of a comedic book, sorry. In terms of like genre, but it is excessively dark. There is not a single bright point in that entire plot line. It is just one depressing thing happening after another. And in The Crying of Lot 49, you at least have the simultaneous vision of female liberation touched upon. You still, and in Vineland, you still have this, you have this core where even as you watch as these crises hit this family and their friends repeatedly and all at once, you can sit there and say, yeah, but they have each other, and you can feel it and believe it. And that's not the case with Inherent Vice.
Yeah, Doc is very alone.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that is a really important way to look at Vineland in conversation with the other two books here. It is the one that gives you a solution. It might not be a solution anybody who read Gravity's Rainbow when it was published thought was going to be what Pynchon thought the solution was. But that's the solution he's giving us, and it's the one at the end of the story. At the end, where we're talking about this family who have been torn apart repeatedly.
Well, there's a lot of good points you made there, but I also think that getting back to what we talked about kind of in our introduction to the book in the last episode, that sort of him finding the solution, I think, is probably a portion of why this took so long for him to write. Certainly, of course, there is the aspects that he was writing to much bigger books, much larger books rather, at the time. But I think too, if you had asked Pynchon when he published Gravity's Rainbow what his idea for a solution would be, he'd probably just like kind of stare at you and be like, "Oh, I don't think there is one." Like they're and without getting into stuff at the end of the book, because we'll obviously get there in a few weeks' time. But like, I think that is also part of why this book kind of exists, is to provide a cap to some of that thematic material that he was working towards in kind of his own development and his understanding of the world around him and sort of what he wanted his fiction to do. And so I think that's a really good call out as we continue through the book to think about, not just from our perspective as the people kind of moderating these discussions and providing this for our listeners, but also for our listeners to consider as they read the book with us, if that's an exercise that they're engaging in, is what this book represents from a standpoint of his social critique, or his view on culture and family and sort of the uniquely American things that he writes about. That's very well stated, Will.
Yeah, and it comes down to the fact that some people are listening to this and are already emailing us saying, Gravity's Rainbow gives us a solution. The solution, this is not a spoiler for anybody who's planning on reading and hasn't yet, the solution in that is Kierkegaardian. The solution is to leap without looking and to expect there to be a solution at some point.
Right, yeah.
That's what he did. You know, he lived his life on the road for the next 20 years and eventually came back writing a family drama. Like, you know, that he found where he landed. And you disagree. But there's a certain kind of tone in more recent readings of Vineland that view his personal solution to the problem as some indictment against them, and I think that's a wrong-headed way to look at it too.
Naturally, to their conversation at Vineland Lanes and the kind of, I guess, weirdness that ensues is the way that I would describe it. This is not a normal conversation.
No, it's something else.
And certainly gets to the idea that Hector is not okay. So what did we think about their actual conversation and sort of the attempt at a connection that Hector is pushing towards here?
All I want to say is that the fact that Hector is described as doing a somewhat permanent Ricardo Montalban impression just killed me. Like I could not read his lines thinking about that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. I want to apologize in advance to anybody who listens and is offended by what will inevitably be one of us reading Hector's dialogue and slipping into it. And I hope it's understood that the presence of the accent in the book is a joke. That Hector is doing a stereotype of himself.
Mm-hmm.
That we are not trying to mock anybody. That we are just, the character is layers of irony of that, and so it's hard to keep in your mind that he's not doing a stupid voice. So just in advance, apologies to anybody who's sensitive around that, because it's gonna happen and we can't avoid it because it's very well written. Like the accents are in here and everything. If you're just listening to this without reading along.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't know who Ricardo Montalban was, just go on YouTube real quick. You don't need to hear a lot. Like 5 seconds is about all you need to really get what this is getting at.
Yeah, he is who you think he is. If the name sounds familiar, you're not confused.
Yeah, absolutely. And just from a plot perspective, like we learn that Zoid's ex-wife was in witness protection and has now disappeared, and Hector is coming to him to try and get him to find a way to get her to resurface, and that is sort of the gambit that he's trying to push Zoid into. But we also get a reveal that Hector is addicted to television, which happens in probably the funniest way, because if you have read the book before, you definitely pick up on his like preening obsession, like the fact that he can't stop looking at the television, the fact that there's references to like him speaking referentially to television through the course of their conversation, and even like including
whistling the Flintstones theme song
exactly
for an extended period of time.
Which is definitely one of the funnier moments in this chapter, a la, Isaiah 2:4 waiting in a room, for who knows how long. Like, I can't imagine sitting across from somebody who's just whistling the Flintstones theme song for an indeterminate period of time. And obviously television and television addiction is a pretty big thing that comes up over the course of Pynchon's work. We talked about it a lot already in previous episodes, and he seems to be very explicit in this book, at least so far, in talking about that as a potential danger or disruptive element to somebody's life. Certainly it's affecting Hector in a significantly negative way. And we get towards the end of it, just to kind of cap off this aspect of it, the arrival of I don't even really know how to describe the people from Never, like a like hit squad of goon squad of like jackbooted thugs who appear in like uniforms that reminded digicam and like uniforms that reminded me of like UN soldiers is the picture that I had in like my head reading this.
I think it's funny because they're done in such a TV trope style that it lends a certain irony to the fact that they're doing what they're doing. But that whole scene when the first time we meet them, and I kind of want to spend a second on this whole TV thing, because I think this is a really important thematic element of this book. But just the way they burst into the room and the way in which it is described is so 1980s television. Like that shit is straight out of Nash Bridges. Like it's exactly like you said, like it's these jackbooted dudes that just, they're breaking the doors down and they're yelling and screaming, and it's so over the top, and it's absolutely hilarious. And if you don't if this is your first time reading it, it's a bit of a gate crash moment. For sure. As is really like the whole thing with Hector's obsession. Like it starts out so subtle, like the little Flintstones thing is so subtle, but it's so perfect for setting the table of like this man is absolutely out of his goddamn mind. But yeah, I think it's, we have talked before, especially in Lot 49, obviously in Lot 49, not in Mason and Dixon, but about Pynchon's I don't want to call it an obsession, but he talks about TV a lot when it is relevant, obviously to the story. And I think that it's never more explicit than it is in Vineland, or condemning.
Yeah.
It's, I think that what he's essentially, I don't want to get too deep into it because obviously it becomes a much bigger thing as the book goes on. But I think ultimately, the idea of television as both a means of entertainment and escapism and honestly art, is in this sort of like really delicate balance with it as a tool to distract. And it's, I don't, I'm trying to say this without getting too far into ahead of the book, but I think that's really, if this is your first time reading it, that is really, really, truly something to keep in mind as you're going through this. Is yes, TV can do a lot of good. A lot of good has come from it. It is a good form of entertainment. It can be fun to watch, but it can also be a very dangerous thing, almost to the point of being a drug. And just bear that in mind if this is your first time reading it, because that is super, super important to all of this.
Yeah, I'll just read their entrance into the story before we get to Will's reaction to it, because I think it's worth going through. Where it says, "Madre de Dios!" An oddly panicked, high-pitched Hector was up and running for the kitchen. Luckily, Zoid noted, having left a 20 on the table, now with a platoon of folks come crashing in after him. What was this? All wearing identical camo jumpsuits and crash helmets with the word "never" stenciled on. 2 stayed by the door, 2 more went over to check the bowling alley. The rest went running on after Hector into the kitchen, where there was already a lot of screaming and clanging. Dude in a white lab coat over Pendleton shirt and jeans now came strolling in between the 2 door people, heading for Zoid, who beamed insincerely, "Never saw him before!" Like, it is such an amazing entrance of this aspect of the book into the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. What it really captures there is what kind of leads into what I'm gonna theorize here. I do actually, sorry, I have read this book before, but the television part, when I read it the first time, I couldn't grapple with it. I don't know, I didn't grab onto any of what the social criticism was meant or could be meant. So I'm going to say some things which might come across to somebody who's read the book like I am getting ahead of myself. If I am, I'm not aware of it. But it seems to me that this scene can be read very explicitly, about as explicit as far as Pynchon's social criticism goes. At the uneven way that the drug war has been waged versus the war on television, which he is essentially proposing here as a historical counterfactual. That you can see a lot of the issues that people ascribe to, like smoking too much pot, in Hector's behavior here. He's all over the place. He doesn't fit the tone. He gets really melodramatic about, like, seriously, man, you're complaining about the fact that this guy who you've been haranguing for years and threatening to lock up for his whole life and take away from his child, you're complaining that he doesn't ask you about your family enough? Like, that is outrageous. And it's all these things that are, oh, drugs make you crazy. And in this case, it's Hector, the guy who Zoid has been sitting around thinking, man, Hector is like this badass guy who's married to his job, whose entire internal life is about remembering and memorializing the people who he's had to so cruelly put down in pursuit of what he believes to be right. And at the same time, you see as the guy's completely unraveled because he just watches the Brady Bunch too much, essentially. And it's obviously, you're not supposed to sit here and think that Pynchon's telling you that television is like heroin or something. But there is this deep morass between the way these two things are treated. When the main difference seems to be that one of them is controlled by a central authority or a small set of central authorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think getting to sort of in extra textual comparison, like as the resident like David Foster Wallace person, there is a lot that this book kind of circles around that also Infinite Jest talks about in relation to television and television or entertainment as an addictive force, and how that has the possibility to be just as destructive as something like drugs. They are compared somewhat in that other text, and I think it's interesting that this book came out 4 years before Infinite Jest did, in that these two authors who probably knew each other, and at the very least David Foster Wallace was an admirer of Pynchon at one point in his life, talked about them in very similar ways, kind of ahead of the time where that would have felt like a completely relevant critique. But I do think that there is an interesting sort of irony that exists in that Hector is this federal agent who was known for busting up, drug rings and drug dealing, and that was like the thing that he was trying to get, Zoid to turn on his friends to deliver information for, and how whenever he kind of over the course of their conversation refers back to all of the money that Zoid could have made, he keeps referring to like, yeah, maybe you would have had enough money for more than just drugs, and maybe you would have had money for more than, just, the descriptions of what he has that Zoid might have been spending his money on. While also being a different kind of addict, I think is very interesting. And also I think gets to some degree of what we've been talking about, at least in the last episode, and now of the expansion of not just entertainment culture, but consumer culture, and how those things became incredibly weaved together in the home in a way that I don't think a lot of people were prepared for. Because, TV in the 60s and 70s was this kind of like new invention and this like interesting thing that suddenly everybody had the access to in their own home. Whereas once you get to the 80s, it became weirder for someone not to have a television in their home, and it became stranger for them to not engage with it as their primary sort of maybe stress relief or like way to unwind at the end of the day. And there, I think, became a very decreased focus on what that could mean if you were going home and turning on the television for 4 hours and then going to bed, which is very much a situation that we still live in, albeit, the delivery mechanism for it is a little bit different. And yeah, I just find it very interesting that Pynchon is talking about those things, 30 years maybe before it would have been a relevant topic for a lot of other books to be talking about, or
yeah,
a larger sort of social climate issue. And I think that it gets to the heart of kind of the cultural aspects of this book that we've been already discussing. And it is, as all three of us have now said, very difficult to talk about this without getting into things that happen as the book goes on. So I suppose I'll leave my thoughts there as a pay attention to that as we continue, because it is a big part of this book, and it sits very squarely at the heart of it. Did we have anything that we wanted to add on to that, or do we want to talk about weird theories as to how Hector treats his food?
Well, so real quick, I do want to just piggyback on something you mentioned earlier about Zoid, about Hector kind of needling Zoid about, you could have made all this money and bought things that weren't drugs, because we do also in this chapter kind of get a peek at Zoid's sort of dual personality, his duality, I guess, in that he's, this relic of an era that was all about, anti-establishment and dismantling the system and not working with the man and all this, but he's not above taking Hector's money. He just won't spend it on drugs. Like he will buy everything else under the sun with it. But he just won't buy drugs with it. So and I think that was kind of, emblematic of a lot of those 60s counterculture icons. Like I mentioned some of those people before, both in the Lot 49 episodes and in our last Vineland episode, guys like Jerry Rubin went on to become a political figure in California. And, even Abby Hoffman, who essentially started and like really was the sort of figurehead behind a lot of the 60s counterculture, to the point of, he wrote Steal This Book, and he led the campaign to try to levitate the Pentagon, and all this other weird stuff. And then he became an FBI informant in the 80s.
Yeah.
And it's depressing. It really is, because I spent a lot of my high school like really kind of deeply entrenched in a lot of 60s counterculture literature, especially Abby Hoffman stuff, and to see what happened to all those guys, and women too. Like it's depressing as hell. And it's not there's I'm trying to think how to say this. They're not without blame. They obviously made the choices that they made that got them to the point where they ended up. But I think it also shows a lot of the power of the system that they were fighting against, that just brutalized them and beat them down to the point where they really had nothing else to do but start working with them to stay alive in some cases. And I think we kind of see that in Zoid. Like, there is still that kind of fire in him to damn the man, so to speak. But at the end of the day, like, he buckled under the weight of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, while still clinging to this idea that he didn't.
It's a delusional thing. Like, he really,
absolutely.
Truly, they believe that they are still fighting the fight, but in reality, they're just, they're the next stage of what they were being pushed towards. Yeah,
and I think even one of the things that I guess I would point people towards if they're looking for a real life examination of something like that, maybe more so to like Zoid's perspective of the delusion of it, rather than sort of the cultural figures that you've mentioned, but still has intersection with that, is the story of the person who caused Fred Hampton's murder. There was a movie made about it called Judas and the Black Messiah. It's pretty solid. Like, I'd recommend people look at it. But the individual who was working with the FBI to supply like the coordinates of Fred Hampton's house in Chicago and what the layout of his apartment was, and eventually the sort of, I don't know what drug it was, but the drug that was slipped to Fred Hampton that caused him to stay asleep when the FBI raided his house and eventually shot him. He did this very weird interview on television, I want to say 30 years after Fred Hampton's murder, where he was kind of telling his story from within the Black Panthers, but he didn't get into the fact that the entire reason he was present in the Black Panthers was because he was an FBI informant, and he was trying to erase his own sort of chance at being sent to prison for unrelated crimes. And then there is a really haunting moment in this interview that is at the end of Judas and the Black Messiah, where when people ask, like, the interviewer asks him like what he would tell his kids about his time in the movement, and he is fully convinced that he was a part of it. Like, he's fully convinced that he did his part for the struggle and for the culture, and that he was not acting in the way that he was. And like, that is obviously delusion to a similar but probably more severe degree given the actions that he undertook. But this is a very real thing that occurred with a lot of people from, these low-level members of the Black Panthers who were put there by the FBI, all the way up to the people that you're talking about, Cody. So it's very much in dialogue with a lot of real life history. And I think now that I'm kind of talking about it like this, if you'll indulge me for a second, I think that a part of the reasoning behind why maybe this book is overlooked or less considered for all the reasons we talked about is also the fact that Pynchon puts less of that on the page. There are segments of Gravity's Rainbow or his larger text where he will just tell you certain parts of history or things that are relevant to the other things that he's discussing, stuff like the Herero genocide or the existence of the Schwarz Commando and things like that. He sort of allows the reader to get that history through his own writing, whereas that's not present in Vineland. Like, Vineland is in conversation with the real world history that all of this is getting at, but it is significantly less written out on the page for the reader to experience. It requires the reader to actually investigate and kind of search that out to a greater degree than they probably would have to with some of his other work.
It's kind of COINTELPRO hides behind like the whole story, like Isaiah 2:4, just like lurking in the shadows, like it's there, but it's not like, you know, it's not going to be up front and present. But yeah, it's a really good point.
Will, did you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just I wanted to add that I think it's poignant that the only thing that doesn't get a response in their conversation, you know, they're going back and forth, not necessarily very rapidly. You know, they're taking breaks to eat in between. They're sitting and thinking and just kind of staring at each other and throughout the scene. But the only thing that actually doesn't get a response is Hector's kind of cathartic rant at the end of that stretch of the conversation where he says, "Hey, all right, fuckhead, try this. You are going to have to die. Yeah, remember that? Death. After all them years of nonconformist shit, you're going to end up just like everybody else anyway. Ha! Ha! So what was it for? All that living in the hippie dirt, driving around some piece of garbage, ain't even in the blue book no more, passing up some really serious bucks you could have spent not just on yourself, but your kid, but on all your beloved bro and sister hippie fools who could have used it as much as you?" And I think one way to read that is, you know, Pynchon putting his voice behind Hector's, but I don't think that's what it is, because Pynchon has shown time and time again he doesn't feel the need to couch himself in a character's voice.
Mm-hmm.
He's fine just addressing the reader. But what I think the reason I think it's telling that Zoe doesn't respond to that is that it's the only thing so far that isn't founded on anything but like television tropes.
Yeah.
As we see in the next chapter, Zoid is constantly thinking about his own mortality. Maybe not directly, but you don't think about, you know, the last 14 years that you've gone without your ex without like constantly also thinking about like endings in general. Those things are not separate, especially not in the mind of a massive stoner.
Right. Well, especially too because Zoid refuses to refer to Frenessy as his ex-wife.
Yeah.
Like he can't reconcile with that, so just refers to her as his wife. That is very telling of where his mind state as a whole is really at.
Yeah, he's not he is not the stereotype. He is the old guard. He is a hippie. He is a sour old hippie, but he is also somebody who understands that he's gonna die. That was never his issue. Mm-hmm. His issue was that his life kind of got pulled out from under him.
Mm-hmm. As a lot of the people in that countercultural movement happened, and I think that's why so many of them just became weird Christians, as we've already talked about in the last episode, or just kind of, you know, had a safety net behind them where they could just go to Orange County, which I believe is also referenced in these early chapters too, and just start a completely different life for themselves. It was never something that they were fully committed to, in the sense that it was something they were sold out on. They always had somewhere else to go, and Zoid does not. He's still there, and he's still doing what he can to carry the torch, so to speak. So did we have any theories about the food mentioned, and in particular why Hector is dismantling his lunch?
I mean, I think the only thing I can think that explains that is that it's maybe not a coping mechanism, but like a distracting mechanism to kind of keep his mind off of TV related anything. It's you know, something else to hyperfixate on, if only for a little while, because he I mean, he really is going about it in a very meticulous manner. So it clearly, and I think they even like, I don't have the page in front of me, but it's described as like he had a methodology or something to that effect in mind. Like he really had a way of doing this, that it wasn't just like he was bored and pushing his food around.
Yeah. Well, and maybe this is reading too deeply into it, but a lot of people who are detoxing from drugs can't eat. Like they just don't have that ability.
Appetite,
yeah, they don't have an appetite, or they just like play with their food. And I don't believe there's really much description of Hector really eating much of it. It is just sort of this weird, like nervous deconstruction rather than anything else.
Yeah. He began to take it apart piece by piece and reassemble as something that Zoid could not identify, but which seemed to hold meaning for Hector. So yeah, he's doing it for a reason. It's just not for us really to know. But that's kind of what I get out of it.
Yeah, I just interpreted it as these two chapters are really the strongest in terms of their relation to noir tropes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I took it as part of the double take for the oh my gosh, the Never people have arrived, is that the reader is expecting in this context the pin to drop that Hector's waiting for, to be something like a, one of his co-workers who doesn't know he's working this case or something. I think it might be an elaborate part of that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just the slow anxious ticks forming, like Cody said.
Yeah, like scenes in, that's a good point, like scenes in noirs where they meet in diners or whatever, and one of them is constantly looking over their shoulder, nervously fidgeting around instead of actually
moving a cigarette around in their hands or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to be fair to Hector, I do think that there's some truth to the fact that a tostada is as much as I do love them, they are an imprecise eating implement.
Yeah, you're basically eating the plate your food's on. So
yeah, exactly. That's the best way to put it. Yeah.
If we don't have anything else on chapter 3, that does bring us pretty cleanly to chapter 4, where Zoid has left after his conversational partner has escaped through the kitchen, and is trying to kind of go about his day the best that he can, trying to figure out what he has to do from here, and also we just get a snapshot of what a day in the life of Zoid Wheeler is like. And that brings us to this very long section of him driving and doing errands, where we get a glimpse into their marriage, their relationship, particularly the multi-day wedding party that they had after they got married, and really what is, as I mentioned at the top of the show, some of my favorite stuff from these two chapters. What do we think about this section as he's recounting his marriage and the way that they not only got married, but the connection that they had?
I do just want to point out before we talk about that we should not overlook what Zoid is driving during this time, which is, if you've not seen the camper shell whose unusual design gave the vehicle some cornering problems, it's like a Baba Yaga on wheels. Like it's a cabin. It's a literal cabin on the back of a flatbed truck. So I think knowing that just makes all of it so much more funny.
Well, yeah, and it's the back of a Datsun flatbed truck.
Yeah.
So it's tiny.
Yeah, which he doesn't even get to drive for that long because he has to give it to someone else to borrow too, and then seems to get a worse car in return for that.
No, so actually, he that is the car he ends up with at the end of the chapter. That is what he's driving around, I think. He's giving
because his
away.
Car gets taken away.
Right.
Yeah.
It took forever to untangle that. And along those lines, really notable omission from this section is that we don't see how Fernesi and Zoid meet. Like it feels like you do. You get to see a snapshot of where Zoid is at when they meet, and you get to see his like mental state as during the whirlwind of their meeting and their early relationship, but you don't actually get any description of the circumstance, and that is impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true, because it really all you do get the actual description of is their wedding ceremony and the after party, but it doesn't. You're right, Will, in that it doesn't feel that way. Actually, going through it does feel like you get a broader sense of their connection and the relationship that the two of them had, and ultimately a little bit of like sort of what doomed it too, because there's the quote where, you know, almost immediately after they get married, Zoid says something to the effect of, you know, don't you believe that love can like rescue anybody or fix anything? I don't remember his exact wording, and just kind of Frenessy just sort of doesn't respond to that and just kind of looks at him as if that's one of the craziest things that she'd ever heard, which is an interesting response when your wedding, which is essentially a symbolic declaration of love, was such a massive affair that lasted multiple days.
So I think that's a really telling part of the whole Zoid and Frenessy relationship, I think. Because it comes off really as very one-sided, in that Zoid genuinely cares about Frenessy, and just doesn't seem to really have that reciprocated. Like that specific line you were talking about, Frenessy, do you think that love can save anybody? You do, don't you? At the same time, he hadn't learned yet what a stupid question it was. She gazed up at him from just under the brim of the hat. It's, you know, he genuinely does love her, and it's definitely not, whether or not she really loves him, she's definitely not showing that same kind of compassion and that same sort of energy that he is. And I think that's also exemplified in his Dream album.
Oh yeah, that's so depressing.
It is tragically funny. Like I want to read that little passage real quick. So this is on page 36. Zoid's Dream album someday would be an anthology of torch songs for male vocalist called Not Too Mean to Cry. He had arrived in this recurring fantasy at the point where he'd take advertising space late at night on the tube with a toll-free number flashing over little 5-second samples of each tune, not only to sell records, but also on the chance that Frenessy, up late some 3 a.m. out of some warm Mr. Wonderful's bed, would happen to pop the tube on, maybe to chase the ghosts away, and there'd be Zoid at the keyboard in some outrageous full-color tux, someplace along the Vegas Strip, backed by a full house orchestra, and she'd know as the title scrolled by, Are You Lonesome Tonight? One for My Baby, Since I Fell for You, that every one of these disconsolate oldies was about her. So it's really sad. Like he is carrying so much love for this person that's his, like this is what he's envisioning. Is like, I know she's out there with someone else, but maybe there's something I can do to declare how I feel that will ultimately win. And like that little bit tells you so much about like how important to his life, to his identity that is. And it also reminds me as the resident elder on the show of those late night television CD ads that were so prevalent in the 80s and 90s, and are very well described with those little 5-second clips where there's the titles are scrolling by, you'd get the one in yellow that's playing for 5 seconds, and then it was always $19.99 or whatever for 2 discs of pure new age classics or whatever it was.
Yeah, those good old Time Life collections.
The old Time before Columbia House. There was Time Life. But no, it really is really it really is a very tragic portrayal of Zoid, and I can't help but feel for him, because I think that's kind of what we're meant to, but at the same time it's just really sad that he can't let go of this. It's something he knows there's really no chance of getting back, but it doesn't matter.
And I think maybe to step into like a weird theory, or just like maybe I'm being crazy, because I guess that's going to be what we're doing all across Vineland. there is something very similar to bring up Inherent Vice again to their relationship and the one between Doc and Shasta.
Yeah,
Although
yeah.
the one between Doc and Shasta is much more explicit on the page in the narration that just one day Shasta kind of stopped being a hippie and just sort of decided that she was going to go Hollywood and leave all that behind. And then when I really love the description of her return to his apartment at the beginning of Inherent Vice, where it says that like back in those days she could go, not so many days with anything as complicated as a smile or as a smirk, maybe it says, but now she was laying some heavy duty like facial puzzles on Doc. And just the way that it's clear that she has so completely changed from where she used to be. That I feel is almost a more explicit description of the relationship between Zoid and Frenessy, in the sense that Zoid is like a very, to use sort of the literary trope term, like hopeless romantic person, and he's hopelessly romantic about a lot of things. Like he's hopelessly romantic about this relationship in the way that he still, after they've been divorced, can't reconcile the fact that he is, he now has an ex-wife as opposed to a wife, and he still dreams of the days of them getting back together, and dreams of, maybe this isn't over, and maybe some way I can convince her to come back to me, even though, like you said, Cody, she is with other men in his own fantasy of this.
Yeah.
And also just that feels very comparative to him holding on to the dream of that alternative future of the hippie world taking over the mainstream world, and just the fact that he's not able to let go of that either. He's hopelessly romantic about what that represented and what that could have been, and he still is in this position now where he can't move past either of them. And I think it gets to that yearning for an ideal either as, a marriage ideal, as so many people who get married do have, but also yearning for that cultural ideal of what if these things were perfect, and what if, whether it be COINTELPRO or harder drugs or, just changing cultural attitudes hadn't broken all of this up. He is incapable of seeing any of those things as passing him by in the decade that this book is set, where it was firmly passed by, like shot in the head and buried in a shallow grave. And yeah, I think it gets to be so revealing about just Zoid's mental state as a person and how he navigates the world and views it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a tendency in everyone, including you two, to read
Wow.
Zoid
Wow.
to read Zoid as like a failure of a person. And I don't, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I don't think you're saying that. But there's a tendency to say this is somebody who doesn't work in some fundamental sense.
Yeah.
And first of all, I think, especially in contrast to the way Hector talks to him in the previous chapter, it's notable that the setting for all of this reminiscence, he is doing a job. It's not on the books. It's not, he's not employed, but he is doing a job. He is catching crawfish and he is delivering them to restaurants. That is a job. That's not nothing.
Yeah.
And on top of that, before we get to the moment where he asks Frenessy whether love can save anybody, on the same page it says, she and Zoid were sitting together on a bench under a fig tree. And I pointed this out at the beginning of the book, and I'm pointing this out not for the same reason, but especially in conjugation with Isaiah 2:4's name and all of that conversation. And also keeping in mind the title of Vineland. What we have is this set of quotes from various parts of the Bible that George Washington, our friend from Mason and Dixon, used repeatedly throughout his presidency and his campaigns prior to the creation of the U.S. that all of this violence, all of this pain was in pursuit of everybody being able to pound their plowshares, to pound their swords into plowshares and pruning hooks and to sit underneath the fig tree.
Mm.
And right there, we have this scene of Zoid reaching what he thought he was fighting for in some way. He was still fighting the good fight as far as, his political beliefs. But for him, he made it. He got to his fig tree. He got to the success point. And he's still trying to get back to that success point. He still has that goal in mind. That is what fuels him throughout all of this. Whether he can or cannot let go of Frenzy, he is to point to the part of the Bible that most notably includes the fig tree phrase, Micah 4:4. The context is about how the Lord God will come to Israel and protect them. That nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. For everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. And this is coming immediately after Hector has been trying to shake him for honestly 20 years or something, but the immediately previous scene. I think it's important to keep in mind that Zoid is whether you think he's a schmuck or a wreck or whatever, he has a mission. It is a hopeless one, but it's there.
No, I totally agree. I think Zoid's flaws are part of what makes him a great character and makes me as a reader at least really root for him more. Like I really genuinely care about his journey, and I do want him to, kind of get out of his own way at times. I don't dislike him or anything like that, view him negatively. Like I think he's just a very flawed individual, and I think that the way in which he is represented is very accurate to a lot of the people at that time of that age.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not trying to correct you guys. I don't think
No,
that's
I
what you
know.
were saying, but just the way that it can be easy to talk about him can kind of erase this core interest of his, which is to try and find that resolution.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that is something that would be easy to miss.
Yeah, definitely. And if you go through and read the discussion on the Reddit about these chapters that not brought up there, just another example of some of the deeper context being missed, and why I think that this leads to this book having a different opinion.
Hey, that's why we're here, right?
Yeah. Any other comments that anyone wants to add on the relational aspect of the early part of chapter 4 before we get into, I suppose the next part would be the scene with his daughter and him at the pizza parlor.
Yeah, I do just want to say for Will's sake, the purple and green color scheme comes up again at their their wedding with the popsicles that they're eating, or the shaved ice or whatever it is.
Very important.
Yeah,
I'm keeping track of that.
And also, if there's anyone out there who makes mini dresses with Frank Zappa's face on them, I would love to purchase one. The description of that was an excellent piece of clothing.
It really is.
Yeah, just the concept of a mini dress that has just a giant portrait of Frank Zappa's face from the hemline all the way up to the neckline. Which maybe that would look weird given that I also have a portrait of Zappa tattooed on my arm, but I would still wear it.
There's never enough Zappa. It's all good.
No, never enough Zappa. I do love how commonly we bring him up on this show for seemingly little reason.
It's hard not. If I had to make a list of the most Pynchon-esque musical artists, Zappa is the first one that will always come to my mind. So.
Yeah, that's fair, definitely. Yeah.
Before we move on to their meeting at the pizza parlor.
Yeah.
I would like to kind of zoom in just a bit on the very peculiar relationship between Zoid and his apparent best friend.
Oh yeah.
Because it says their friendship, this is Van Meter, by the way, their friendship over the years was based in part on each pretending to laugh at the other's hard luck. And there were scenes in Mason and Dixon where you could, I sat around here pontificating on the beauty of friendship. I don't think this one's universal.
No.
I think I definitely had friendships like this, but they're not normal.
No, it's not.
No, that is a unique kind of friendship that comes out of, I think, being in a band with somebody.
Yeah.
which Zoid was in a band with Van Meter. Yeah, I have had friendships that are based out of playing music together, and I know a lot of people who have had similar friendships, and that seems to be one of the highways where that occurs.
That's a great point.
So yeah, that gets to Zoid's panicked call over to the pizza place that his daughter works at, which is just another very Pynchonian idea or business that you could come up with. The idea that there would be this pizza parlor that is based entirely in like a weird movement of like I'm trying to think of what the particular like Buddhist movement in the 60s was that was popular like in Greenwich Village in New York.
Hare Krishna?
Yeah, exactly. That's absolutely just overall the vibe from here. The quote where it's introduced, I really enjoy, where it says, "Prairie worked at the Bodhidharma Pizza Temple, which a little smugly offered the most wholesome, not to mention the slowest fast food in the region. A classic example of the California pizza concept at its most misguided. Zoid was both a certified pizza maniac and a cheapskate, but not once had he ever hustled Prairie for one nepotistic slice of the Bodhidharma product. Its sauce was all but crunchy, with fistfuls of herbs, only marginally Italian, and more appropriate in a cough remedy. The rennetless cheese reminded customers variously of bottled hollandaise or joint compound, and the options were all vegetables rigorously organic whose high water content saturated long before it baked through a stone-ground 12-grain crust with the lightness and digestibility of a manhole cover."
Oh my god.
I don't know what it is that Pynchon has for describing just awful pizza.
The worst food.
Well, he's a New Yorker, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is two books in a row where there is a description of an insane pizza. And this, you're correct, Will. This does seem very much just like a man who lived in LA for a while and was like, "Why can't I get any fucking good pizza around here?" just bleeding over into a book that he was writing. And I also just, yeah.
The particular call out of herbs in a cough remedy.
Yeah.
There are two ways to go with that. One is horrifying, and it is like mint. And the other is honestly worse. It's Jägermeister.
Ooh,
Oh god.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking when he says that.
Ah, God. Yeah.
What got me was the rennetless cheese.
Yeah.
Because so for a little bit of context here, when my daughter was born, when she was young, she still has a lactose intolerance, and so we for a long time had to give her like vegan dairy products. And I don't know if either of you have ever had vegan cheese.
I have.
It is honestly one of the worst things I've ever consumed in my life. Like
it's not all that bad.
the ones we had absolutely were. To call it cheese, it seems unfair to anybody who makes or eats cheese. You can't cook with it because it doesn't work like cheese.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real just interesting concoction, but thankfully we got around it and she's able to, we don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to eat that anymore. So, but that part got me. Like that really put the taste in my mouth. So
To speak for the vegans somewhat, not that I am a vegan, but as someone who has flirted with veganism several times in her life, that is a fair description of most vegan cheese. However, Tillamook, the actual like cheese producer, does have a vegan cheese that I find very good.
if anybody was going to make a good vegan cheese, I would put it on them, on the fine folks at Tillamook. Not sponsoring this show. Yeah.
Although, if you want to sponsor this show, like,
please, I will take all of the cheese.
Absolutely, the cheese, the butter, everything.
Yeah, I mean they're up where the hippies went. So yeah,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, the newer like cashew milk based cheeses are kind of okay. They don't melt right, like you said, but at least they taste okay.
Yeah,
I guess at the end of the day, that's what matters. So,
but that's only been in the last like 7 years or so that it existed. So, like most of it's terrible. It tastes like bean paste.
I do also love that he comes up with a way to describe a dough that is both incredibly soggy and also just mind-blowingly hard to eat as well. Just
simultaneously,
that whole paragraph is just. I guess if I was to bring up like Pynchon's humor to somebody, like trying to describe his humor, that would potentially be one of the quotes that I would go to first.
That would be one of them. The other one
definitely
will come in a little bit, but yeah, that's definitely one. The other, I do want to say, the other food mention that came up in here was the combination of Captain Crunch and Diet Pepsi. Which is also just awful because it's not described how those things are combined. It just says sitting over a breakfast of Captain Crunch and Diet Pepsi. I don't know if he's having them separately, if he has poured the Diet Pepsi into the Captain Crunch. Neither is a good choice.
Yep.
But it's still a very unsettling image.
Yeah, but and just as we've talked about in the last episode, the mass produced food and kind of what that led to as far as not just the obesity epidemic, but just like what were people eating? Like I definitely had some questionable meals in my childhood.
Also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that are not far off from some of the stuff described in this book.
Yeah, well, that also goes back to the 60s where the use of gelatin became very prevalent, and so they put fucking everything in gelatin.
I'm sorry, do you have a problem with aspic? Aspic is one of life's great pleasures.
Is it though?
Aspic is important. Do you have a problem with a single piece of broccoli suspended in the middle of a Jello mold of a bunt pan?
That I can do that. They put fish in there. That's where you have to draw a line in the sand somewhere, and it's there.
Yeah, there's a I unfortunately don't know this person's name, but there is a great Instagram, and I'm sure he's also on TikTok, a guy who goes through recipes from like the 40s, 50s, and 60s when cookbooks started to become like a prevalent thing in American culture, just making some of the insane recipes that people came up with out of, I guess, easy access to ingredients with the development of grocery stores. There's some crazy stuff in there.
The only good one from that era is Chicken a la King, and that's still not great.
Yeah, that's fair. At least we know that Will's being paid by Big Aspic now.
Look, they've got to put their money somewhere, and one person is about what their budget can cover.
We're not getting the Tillamook money yet, so we got to take more. What sponsors we can get? None
of us are getting Aspic money other than Will either.
True.
Look, I promise you, we could not divide it up. We could afford, I don't know, a puppuccino.
Those are free.
I know. But you did overlook one other section in this chapter featuring food, which I'm just going to read because I think it doesn't quite match
tofu
pizza, but yeah.
Oh yeah.
The waitresses at La Boucheron affamée gathered over in a corner murmuring, casting him slow over-the-shoulder looks it was hard even for him to take as anything but pitying. "Hi, ladies, how's the warm duck salad today?" But nobody came forth with much more than mentions of ubiquitous the one named Hector. Back on the freeway, Zoid kept a defensive eye out in all directions, no telling where the two maddened detox escapee might pop up. At his next stop, Humbolaya, amid stomach nudging aromas from the special of the day, tofu a la etouffee. Zoid hustled use of the office phone to call Doc deeply on the direct line into his wing of the Vineland Palace. I mean, tofu a la etouffee. I love etouffee. I'd try it. It would probably just be mush.
I can't imagine what else it would be.
Unless you like deep fried the tofu.
That might be good, yeah.
Yeah. Again, speaking as the semi-vegan, tofu's pretty good. You prepare tofu in some pretty solid ways.
I do just want to also shout out those two names of the restaurants are great.
They really are.
Oh yeah.
That's why I started so early before the food, because seriously, that's great.
Not just the two restaurants too, but the two bars that it's mentioned. The one that he normally hangs out at, but the one that he decided to go to instead of in order to escape Hector. I wish I had the page marked, but those were also some excellent names for places. It is also mentioned too that when he calls his daughter at the restaurant, she is on a meditation break, which just like which just makes me, again, like to the Hare Krishna point, like if you walk into this restaurant at the right time, is it just going to be a bunch of people sitting around chanting Hare Krishna? And like you can't even order the pizza? Is that why this is the slowest fast food in town?
Yeah,
like
they have to finish their sound bath before they can do anything else.
So that section you were referring to, Kate, is Zoid had only missed him that night by not showing up at the Lost Nugget, his usual hangout, having chosen instead a booth way in the back of the Steam Donkey, just off the old plaza in Vineland. The Steam Donkey is excellent.
God.
Yeah. This is like a town I want to live in. Like it's such a weird, like Twin Peaksy place.
Exactly. Yeah.
You need to visit Eugene, Oregon.
Okay. I'm going to Portland next year, so maybe we'll take a trip up to Eugene.
There you go.
Yeah. There's a lot more to do in Portland, but you'll get your taste of these folks.
So when Zoid calls, he's basically just warning his daughter about everything going on with Hector. But there is a line in here that I specifically wanted to spotlight that I liked, where when he is attempting to like warn her of what is going to happen or what could happen, and just to kind of like wait there until he shows up. She says, just because they look evil, Dad, doesn't mean they're any good for muscle, if that's what you're thinking, in reference to the metalheads that her boyfriend hangs out with and that are going to come pick her up. Which I love that as an inclusion, because that is also in a lot of cases very true about people in those communities. They look scary if you're someone who's, I guess, uninitiated or is just ignorant, but they're just people. Like they're
metalheads are some of the nicest people I've ever met. Like genuinely nice people.
Absolutely. That was a line that I wanted to make sure that we circled over. And then we get another conversation when he eventually gets to the restaurant that is similarly tragic to the one that we talked about last week. In some of the way that Prairie refers to her father. I know you had made some notes about this, Cody, if you want to expand on that.
So this is right after Isaiah 2-4 and his friends came in, and Isaiah said that he would protect Prairie, and so the line that starts is Prairie was and getting annoyed. What is this typical males? You're handing me back and forth like a side of beef? How about pork? Isaiah, slightly to Zoid's relief. At least this unwise now actually trying to poke her playfully in the ribs while she smacked his hand away. Good luck, young fella. And then it goes on a little bit after that, where she says, I'll start with the whole paragraph because I think that's probably a good place to go. But all you ever date is this. Sorry, but really B material in terms of family skills. Girls you pick up when they're out on eating binges at the Arctic Circle drive-in. Girls from these weird after-hours clubs whose whole wardrobe is like totally black. Girls who inject cough syrup with biker boyfriends named In fact, lots of them girls I see in school every day. Know what I think? She'd rolled out of her lower bunk to stand and look at him in the face, level. is that deal or no deal, you must have always loved my mom so much that if it couldn't be her, it wouldn't be anybody. Like Prairie is so good at bringing Zoid back down to reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love that particular part. I also like her, standing up and, not letting Isaiah and Zoid be the ones to dictate like how she's going to, who's going to protect her more. Like she's a grown woman at this point. She can take care of herself and she doesn't need these two dudes, constantly doting around and trying to, keep her safe when she can do that perfectly fine herself. So I think Prairie's kind of the unsung hero of the whole story. I think she's the one that really does the best job of grounding Zoid and really reminding him and humbling him when he needs to be humbled.
Yeah, and I also like what you mentioned about her bringing him back down to earth, because for context for the listener, like those quotes come from when Zoid actually arrives at the restaurant. But when he calls ahead of time, he kind of spells out his fear about the stuff with Hector, and her response is basically just like, is this just hippie paranoia? Mm-hmm. Like, and specifically refers to, I think she says, geez, with all that shit you smoke, your mind must be like an Etch-a-Sketch, which is like, for someone reading Pynchon, whether this is your first time through the book or not, you kind of have this understanding that like Zoid's probably not all that, unfounded in his paranoia. But if you just look at the facts of what has happened so far, there isn't really anything for him to be that freaked out about. Like, yes, his ex-wife has disappeared from witness protection, and he's been asked to help get her back, and Hector is running around trying to, like, run into him everywhere. Okay? Like, is that like, if genuinely analyzing that from a standpoint of what has happened, is there really much of a reason for him to be that freaked out about it? Like, she very clearly is that stabilizing force for her father in a way that wasn't incredibly present until now. But if you go back and I think read through the first two chapters with that in mind, that is even present in those conversations that they have as well.
Yeah, and I really like I like the fact that you point out that she's grown up. Because the fact is that she is grown up in the sense that she can decide where the hell she goes. But she is still a teenager. She is still like 15, 16 or something.
That sounds right.
And she is portraying that right in the middle of telling off her dad and boyfriend for being, stupid. She is also basically saying, look, don't you want to get back with mom? If you were me, wouldn't you want that too? Which is, as much as it is a fairly universal experience for children of divorce who didn't come out of a truly horrendous home, as much as that's fairly universal, it is also one that part of that universality is growing up and learning to accept it. And she hasn't reached that stage yet.
Oh, and to be fair, neither has Zoid.
No, exactly. Yeah. That's the extent which he hasn't grown up. It's not about not accepting death. It's that he hasn't accepted that, he just has to move on without Frenesi. So
that gets to a question that I had. What do you guys make of the scene at the bank when Zoid arrives and the staff / security of the bank greet him the way that they do?
Well, he keeps writing post-dated checks.
Yeah.
Right?
I think it might be that simple, that they just don't want him anywhere close to them because he causes them so many headaches.
The funny thing, though, is they don't appear to not want him anywhere nearby because they're trying to get him to come inside after they're closed. I'll read the quote because it was another one of those ones that I just found really funny. Where it says, feeling unprotected on all flanks, Zoid went speeding in, running lights and ignoring stop signs to Vineland, where he just made it to the door of the bank at closing time. An entry-level functionary in a suit who was refusing admission to other latecomers saw Zoid and, for the first time in history, nervously began to unlock the door for him, while inside colleagues at desks could be seen making long arms for the telephone. No, it wasn't pothead paranoia, but neither was Zoid about to step inside this bank. A security guard sauntered over, unsnapping his hip holster. Okay. Zoid split with a That's All Folks wave, having luckily parked Trent's rig just around the corner. So obviously there is the post-dated checks part, and the fact that I think that they're just trying to ensnare him to possibly get him arrested. But I do think it's interesting that scene happens just before we get another scene where he's accused of being paranoid. Where in this case he probably has some legitimate fear of hanging around given the response. But I did find that particular section quite funny. In the description of his reception of just like, oh no, we can't let anyone else in. Oh wait, get that guy in here right now.
Get him in here. We will bust his ass.
And also, like, if you're writing that many post-dated checks, just cancel his account. Like, I feel like there are so many other ways that the bank could do this other than waiting for him to show up in, like, a sting operation.
Yeah, I get the sense that the sting operation of it all is a bit of a pothead paranoia thing.
Sure.
But that there isn't, it is inherently suspicious that the manager's like, come on in, Zoid.
Yeah. Just the idea that, like, because they're, if you, I'm sure a majority of our listeners have smoked pot at least one time in their life, but like there is moments there where it does cause a distortion of reality, where like the idea that he would see not one but multiple people reach for telephones is such a perfect encapsulation of when you're having that kind of an experience on drugs where you're that paranoid. Is just, it's very accurate. It's one of those things that I love about Pynchon's writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are one of the I imagine 2 people who listen to this podcast who have never smoked weed or had any kind of experience like that, it's like in The Crying of Lot 49 talking about the sensitization thing. That's what it is.
Yeah.
It is the sense of like you are being hypersensitive to nothing, essentially.
Right. I think that brings us to, drumroll please, Cody's crazy conspiracy corner.
I don't really have anything that juicy this week. Suffice to say, I know. It's not mentioned. I went to the wiki hoping that I could prove myself right about this, but it's not on there. But I just want to say, and I could be wrong because this is my conspiracy time. The Rick and Chick characters, I don't remember if they were given last names off the top of my head or not. I feel like they were. No, they weren't. No. Rick and Chick are, as far as I'm concerned, Tom and Ray Magliozzi, Click and Clack, Tappet Brothers from NPR.
Oh, crap.
That just like, I got those 2 in my head when I read the description of them. I was like, oh yeah, it's probably those 2. So that's the voices I have, is these like hyper exaggerated Bostonian accents. But I don't know. It wouldn't be surprising if Pynchon listened to Car Talk. I think that's it would be in his wheelhouse. Like, they had a very unique sense of humor.
Yeah.
And they were super smart. Those guys both went to like they might have gone to MIT. They went somewhere really prestigious as far as school, and I think they were, or one of them was around the same age as Pynchon. So yeah, I don't know. Find a way to listen to Car Talk. It's not on the radio anymore, but that was a great show. That
was a great show.
I still listen to it. It's good. Yeah,
it's fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally there, especially when you keep in mind that, like, their whole sense of humor, like you said, is weird and slightly Pynchonian. It's Pynchonian because, like, they are experts at making cars run.
Yeah.
And then normal people called in, and they would just harangue them over, basic, like, misunderstandings of how a car is supposed to function. And it's the kind of thing that is only truly hilarious if you understand exactly how wrong the callers are. And at the same time, they're not making fun of the callers. They're making fun of the fact that we're all driving these stupid things and none of us know how they work.
We're driving these incredibly complicated machines and have absolutely no concept of what makes them go.
Yep. Another like analog that reminds me of is the show was not meant to be comedic, but Suze Orman used to have a late night show where people would call in and ask whether or not it was a smart idea for them to buy something. And she would then proceed to go over their finances while they were on the phone. and essentially harangue them over the stupidity of their financial decisions and why it is that they thought it was necessary to purchase a Valentino purse or some other expensive product. That is a subgenre of humor that is very enjoyable if you can find it. Who wants to talk about the Marquis de Sade?
Well, okay, before we get into that, because I do want to talk about that, I do just want to bring up the fact that Eusebio and Vato had this like self mythologizing moment where they claimed that they used Bigfoot as a means of getting car parts, essentially. So I just want to read this paragraph. Just kills me. Today, inspired by a wave of Bigfoot sightings down in the Mattole, Vato had nearly convinced the skeptical lookalikes that the Escondido had been found abandoned in a clearing, its owners frightened off by Bigfoot, in whose territory the car then sat, anybody's prize, making its retrieval by the boys, who just happened to be out in that part of the brush, an adventure full of perilous grades, narrow escapes, and kick-ass four-wheeling all the way, followed at each turn by the open-mouthed Rick and Chick, upon whom at last blood, usually the closer in these proceedings, laid. So Bigfoot being force majeure, we got the legal salvage rights. Dazed, the twins were nodding at slightly different rates. And another story of Twilight reconfiguration, soon to be the talk of the business, was about to get underway.
Man.
Bigfoot being force majeure.
It almost feels like Rick, Chick, Blood, and Vato are set up as like a who's on first kind of thing.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then it just doesn't come together at all. And I'm always trying to read jokes into these paragraphs that aren't there.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. So speaking of a joke in a paragraph that is there, that certainly brings us to the Marquis de Sade bit, which is it's one of the funnier things that I think any of us have probably read at one point or another.
This is up there with the mechanical duck scene as far as like I was in actual tears reading this.
Do you want to give a rundown, Cody?
So essentially, like, I mean, the name. So basically, just to summarize it, there is a landscaper that Zoid will work for from time to time, who assumed the role of the original landscaper, I think, and uses the name Marquis de Sade, S-O-D, which is arguably the most brilliant business name I think that has ever existed. But who makes these commercials that are just really unbelievably hilarious, featuring talking grass that speaks with an overly pretentious French accent.
More, we love it.
We love it. We can't hear you. Oh my god.
Do we maybe just want to read that?
I don't think I can without like losing my fucking mind.
I can.
Okay. Go for it.
Zoid needed cash and also some advice about a quick change of appearance, and both were available from the landscape contractor Zoid did some lawn and tree work for, Millard Hobbs, a former actor who'd begun as a company logo and ended up as majority owner of what had been a modest enough lawn care service its founder, a reader of forbidden books, had named the Marquis de Sade. Originally, Millard had only been hired to be in a couple of locally produced late-night TV commercials in which, holding a giant bullwhip, he appeared in knee socks, buckle shoes, cut-off trousers, blouse, and platinum wig, all borrowed from his wife, Blodwin. "Crabgrass won't behave?" he inquired in a species of French accent. No problème. Just call the Marquis de Sade. Pretty soon the business was booming, expanding into pool and tree service, and so much profit rolling in that Millard one time thought to take a few points instead of the fee up front. People out in the non-tubal world began mistaking him for the real owner, by then usually off on vacation someplace, and Millard, being an actor, started believing them. Little by little, he kept buying in and learning the business, as well as elaborating the scripts of his commercials from those old split 30s during the vampire shift to what were now often 5-minute primetime micro-movies, with music and special effects increasingly subbed out to artisans as far away as Marin. in which the Marquis, his wardrobe now upgraded into an authentic 18th century costume, might carry on a dialogue with some substandard lawn while lashing away at it with his bullwhip, each grass blade in extreme close-up being seen to have a face and little mouth, out of which in thousandfold echoplexed chorus would come piping, "More, more, we love it!" The Marquis leaning down playfully, "Oh, can't hear you." Presently, the grass would start to sing the company jingle to a, by then, post-disco arrangement of the Marseillaise. A lawn servant to lop a tree, and nobody meets Marquis de Sade. Millard was known for spreading work around generously, and for paying in cash, and off the books, too. Half the equipment lot today was filled by a flatbed rig by someplace down in the Mojave, whose load was a single giant rock, charred, pitted, and streaked with metallic glazes. Wealthy customer, explained the Marquis, wants it to look like a meteorite just missed his house.
I love that.
What a strange request for a landscaping job, too.
I just, the other day, drove by a house with an entire front lawn covered in flagstones.
Weird.
So that's what's coming to my mind right now.
Why? What is the motivation?
I think it's the same as wanting to look like a meteor hit your
Meteorite
house.
crash.
I guess, sure. As far as like if I had a crackpot theory or crazy conspiracy corner, this was something that was brought up in context of us talking about this section of the book a few minutes ago. But like, it is entirely possible that the Marquis de Sade bit is there just kind of as a joke, but it and really nothing more. But it did remind me of just the general idea of someone famous for what are essentially little TV movies suddenly becoming the head of a company. Did remind me a lot of Ronald Reagan going from being a television and film actor to becoming the president of the United States. And just,
wow, what a concept. You would imagine that would never possibly happen twice, right?
No, never. And certainly the second time around, he wouldn't use the slogan coined by the first time around.
Funny how history repeats itself.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I there's not much to point to the idea that is what Pynchon is getting at, but it was certainly something that I thought of.
No, but it is similar in tone, and with you thinking on the Reagan line of thinking, it reminded me that it's kind of similar to the adenoid section in Gravity's Rainbow.
Oh.
Just in terms of like a nothing ending up in charge of all of these different things and becoming the central focus.
Yeah.
Which, not going to get into that, but I think there are some ways to connect that blob with Hitler, and probably to also Reagan.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with the like to go deeper into this like weird idea. The specific mention that after he kind of became recognized as the head of the company, that was when he started to learn the trade and suddenly became very adept at deploying, different ways to use money or to kind of expand. That is obviously very much what happened with Reagan after he was elected president. We get another mention of Pat Sajak, everybody. Everyone's favorite genial Pat Sajak.
Yeah,
was he that important?
I don't think. I mean, Wheel of Fortune was Wheel of Fortune, but like, I don't know. I do think it's funny that he's playing Frank Gorshin. That's funny. If anybody has not watched the old Adam West Batman series, do yourself a favor and carve out a few hours because it's a good one.
Yeah.
And Frank Gorshin was a pretty good Riddler.
Thank you. Couldn't place him.
That's pretty much all he's known for. I don't know that he did much else outside of that.
Not that I know of at all.
Not like Frank, Cesar Romero, who refused to shave his mustache even though he was playing the Joker. So it was just always there under his grease paint.
Oh man, especially just And especially the fact that they went with that too. Just be like, yeah, sure, why not?
We could recast it, but why?
Why would we do
let
that?
Let him have his mustache. It's fine.
Really foreshadowing the Henry Cavill controversy with his
Yeah.
mustache in Justice League.
Yeah.
Well, so
I take it back. Frank Gorshin was in some other stuff. He was on Conan a whole bunch, apparently.
Really?
He was in 12 Monkeys.
Oh, weird.
Interesting.
It's one of the background people in the mental hospital.
He's a doctor.
Interesting.
Yeah. So.
So back to the point of all of this.
Yes.
I similarly to us missing seeing Zoid and Frenesi meeting, we also don't see why Millard is handing Zoid the money. You know, we presume that he's explained the situation to some extent, but all we really see is him like, hey, nobody's gonna come and steal your nobody's gonna come and prevent you from paying me back, right? Which he obviously doesn't care about the answer to, because Zoid never pays anyone back. And then it's just in his hand. I found that strange.
Yeah, that is a good. I wasn't really able to parse out what that was about either. We also get an additional aspect of Reagan's wet dream in the campaign against marijuana production.
Yeah.
Which comes up just shortly after this inclusion. Where it says, Trent, a sensitive poet artist from the city, had moved up north here for his nerves, which at the moment were not at their most tranquil. Armored personnel carriers, Trent trying to scream and keep his voice down at the same time, which is also just what a description of someone speaking. Persons in full battle gear stomping through vegetable patches. Somebody said they shot Stokely's dog. I'm in here with a 30-06. I don't even know how to load, Zoid. What's going on? Wait, easy, partner. Now that sounds like camp, meaning the infamous federal state campaign against marijuana production. But it ain't quite the season yet. The concept that they have a camp season where this another group of jackbooted thugs rolls out and rounds up everybody's weed in order to get rid of it. Is like your note here says, that's absolutely what Nancy Reagan probably wanted DARE to be.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is so for context for anyone who doesn't really know the DARE. DARE still happens, I think. I don't know if it's the same thing.
Yeah,
Anyways, this is Reagan had this whole idea that it would, we should go to war against drugs, which was woefully inept and pointless, and continues to be, and has done way more harm than good.
Yeah.
And it's that's absolutely, I think, what's going on here is that's like Reagan, I think, had this idea of like, using the military to enforce this issue that wasn't really an issue until they made it one by introducing crack into a majority African American populations for nefarious reasons, but that's neither here nor there. But it's and again, this is one of those central themes of the book is the this time period, specifically the 80s, when you had these kind of like Reaganomics and hardline ultra conservative wet dreams of like a totalitarian system that operates under the guise of being a democracy, which is always played as being like for the good of the people, but ultimately just like absolutely destroys the lower and most of the middle class. So it's, it's one of those, I could go on and on about how much I fucking hate Reagan and his whole administration. But I've been rewatching The Wire, so like the futility of the war on drugs is never ending, and just always in a different time period, wearing a different costume.
Yeah, and this is a tangent off of your tangent essentially, so apologies to any listeners who find it insufferable. But relevant to all of this is that during the 70s, the cause for what was called the what did they call it, the drought or whatever, that is featured in the beginning of chapter 3 when Hector's showing up and Van assumes he's a weed dealer.
Which is also brought up in Inherent Vice too.
I was about to say, yeah. It's the setting of Inherent Vice is that drought. The cause for that was actually because of some U.S. involvement with spraying paraquat and other very dangerous herbicides on illegal marijuana fields south of the border. And that ties into just a lot of the little things that play into a lot of this book, whether it's the artificial food or just the talking about the helicopters that are part of camp. And camp was not part of that scheme, by the way, but it's there. It's in the background. It's in everybody's mind. In every one of these characters' minds is that paraquat poisoning that was done by helicopters, just like the camp helicopters.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, important context. I wouldn't say that would not be something to include.
Mhm.
We also, through the introduction of camp, learn kind of what Hector's weird, I guess, gambit is, or what it's being positioned as, in that he's found a way to flip the couple of ounces that Zoid has of weed in his house into a claim that it's tons, and they're now going to start using his home as a headquarters for camp as this season, so to speak, starts, to essentially push, as I understand it, Zoid to help him make a film about his ex-wife. This was a very strange sort of detour that it took after explaining that his house had more or less been repossessed. What do we think that this is pointing towards? What are our thoughts on Hector's strange idea of making a film about Frenessi and her old mob connections and things like that?
I see it as the capitulation of like everything that they're saying is wrong with Hector and with television addiction, because in real life nobody does this. But
You'd hope not.
Yeah, but at the same time, some people kind of do. There are people who go around living their whole life thinking like, I just need the rights for one good story, and I'll off to the races. I'm a great director just waiting to happen. Or just like the idea of, this would be so crazy if it were on TV, which is a quote I've heard before, and I'm sure others have too. I think it really is just like, up until this point, Hector's been weird, but he's been weird in the kind of kooky television character kind of sense. He's, he's silly. Here, he is dysfunctional. Like, he is... I'm not sure actually if it does say that he is the one who spun the couple of ounces out. I think it's saying that Brock Vond did that.
Well, he's mentioning that that's what they're going to do.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wasn't sure if you meant to say that. Yeah. But it's just so over the top. It is such an unnecessary position to put somebody in, to try to get them to sign over their likeness rights. Whether he's involved in the actual raid or not, he knows all of this is going down. He could have just asked Zoid.
Right.
He thinks of him as a friend, clearly.
I think too, to look back to kind of the, I guess, analog to drug addiction that we were talking about before too, there are some instances where somebody's addiction to something seems very harmless until suddenly it isn't. And I think to look specifically at, I guess the easiest analog would be marijuana. That is considered a non-habit forming drug, which is true. You don't get physically addicted to it, but there are certainly people who are incapable of functioning without it for one reason or another. And that's where it does step still into something of an addiction. And when you see them without it, or in a drought, so to speak, of it, or something else happens that that causes you to see exactly the depth of that addiction. I feel like there's some of that too, in that, like, him using Brock Von's actions as an additional impetus to get, like you said, Will, just somebody's life rights for a movie that he wants to make, really gives off the vibe of someone scratching their neck asking if somebody has an ounce, and just wanting, yeah, exactly. And wanting to do whatever they can to sort of step into that world even deeper. There's certainly something else going on there, I think, in the very crazed and manic way that he's presenting himself in that scene. Did we have anything else that we wanted to add to chapter 4?
I do appreciate that the way that he is portraying the exact fucked up dynamics of diet culture. Because the screwed up parts of diet culture, as we talk about it today, is not like, you know, you can say it's about like, oh, it's fostering eating disorders, or so you're supposed to be caring about how you look more than how you feel, whatever, however you want to frame it. What it is everybody pointing out something to you over and over again. It is, you know, working at a place that is selling pizza that is the opposite of pizza for supposed health benefits. I think it's very well discussed in this book, the way that diet culture formed in America, and the way that it particularly affects young women. I think it's very evocative.
Yeah, definitely. Although, I mean, like, hey, if there was a pizza that convinced me that getting around in a circle to chant around a federal agent who's whacked out of his mind on Hollywood idealism, it's got to be pretty good pizza. Like, maybe I'd give that a try.
It's that Jägermeister in the sauce again.
Yeah, absolutely. It just gets you a little crazy. Cody, did you have anything else to add to chapter 4?
I don't think so. No.
So that brings us to funny parts. We've covered a lot of them over the course of our discussion. Was there anything else that anyone wanted to add?
I had 2. The first being in the scene we just talked about. It's a throwaway joke, where it just says Doc Deeply grooming his beard, strode over, high-fiving Baba Havabananda on the way. Like, just him, like, given that whole situation, him just strolling through and, like, as an aside, just like giving him a high five. It's just, I don't know, just made me chuckle. That and the brilliantly corny checks in the mayo line.
Yeah. Which is a line that anytime I read that or one of its derivatives like it is here, I can't not think of the opening of Big Trouble in Little China, where Kurt Russell says, "The check's in the mail," and then just takes the most absurd bite of a sandwich while speaking into a CV radio.
There's apparently a name for that type of joke. It was on the wiki. Let me find it real quick, because I didn't know that it was a thing. It's called a throwaway fig hoot. In the 50s, a science fiction writer named Grendel Brierton wrote a series of short, funny pieces for fantasy and science fiction magazine titled Through Time and Space with Ferdinand Fagut. They all worked the same way, establishing a silly and complicated storyline for the sole purpose of setting up a painfully outrageous pun. So that's obviously something that we see a lot in his work. So
yeah, painfully outrageous pun might be my favorite description of a pun.
Yeah.
I would say the one that I would want to add is the description of Zoid's house in Gordita Beach, where on the first page of chapter 3 it says, he showed up first in Zoid's life shortly after Reagan was elected governor of California. Zoid was living down south then, sharing a house in Gordita Beach with elements of a surf band he'd been playing keyboard in since junior high, the Corvairs, along with friends more and less transient. The house was so old that all of its termite clauses and code violations had been waived, on the theory that the next moderate act of nature would finish it off. But, having been put up back during an era of over-design, it proved to be sturdier than it looked, with its old stucco eat net to reveal generations of paint jobs in different beach town pastels, corroded by salt and petrochemical fogs that flowed in the summers onshore up the sand slopes. Just that specific phrase of the termite clauses and code violations had been waived on the theory that the next moderate act of nature would finish it off.
Pretty
That
excellent.
was really good.
Yeah.
A lot of the funniest parts of these sections to me come in very small doses. They're just like little twists on the sincere element.
Sure.
But one part that is purely comic that I love is alls I'd like to know is, will they be after your money? A familiar question around here. Subcontractor accounts collectively having more attachments on them than a vacuum cleaner. More liens, Zoid had once suggested, than the Tower of Pisa, to which Blodwin had answered. More garnishes than a California burger. Spouses, ex-spouses, welfare, the bank, the lost nugget, haberdasheries, and faraway zip codes. It's what you all get for leading these irregular lives. Looks like it's what you get. It's just, not only is the idea of a California burger being covered in bills pretty funny, but also it's what you get, the person who keeps giving him money for some reason.
Yeah.
So that brings us to quotes. Cody, did you want to start?
Sure. Mine is, I had several that I marked off, but I'm going to go with this one from chapter 3. It is on page 29. And it starts, "Ay, se va, go on. Break your old compinche's heart. Here I thought you knew everything. It turns out you don't know shit." Grinning, a stretched and terrible face. It was the closest Hector got to feeling sorry for himself, this suggestion he liked to put out that among the fallen, he had fallen further than most, not in distance alone, but also in the quality of descent, having begun long ago concentrated and graceful as a skydiver, but the tostada procedure was minor evidence. He growing less professional, the longer he fell, while his skills as a field man depreciated. He had come with these falling years simply to rely on going in, trying to neutralize whoever was there with a repertoire of assault. It still ran from stupefy to obliterate. And if they were waiting for him one time and got in the first move, I muere, too bad. Hector sadly knew this wasn't anywhere near the samurai condition of always being on that perfect edge, prepared to die, a feeling he'd known only a few times in his life long ago. Nowadays, with his old fighting talents lapsed, what looked like simple impulse or will might as easily have been advanced self-hatred. Zoid, the big idealist, liked to believe that Hector remembered everybody he'd ever shot at, hit, missed, booked, questioned, rousted, double-crossed, that each face was filed in his conscience. And the only way he could live with such a history was to take these chances with his own badass, upping the ante as he moved into his late mid-career. This theory, at least, had kept Zoid from lying around hatching plots to assassinate Hector, as others had been known to waste hours potentially productive lives doing. Hector was the kind of desperado whose ideal assassin was himself. He could choose the best method, time, and place, and would always have the best motives for it of anyone. I just think that's a great description of Hector as a character. Beautifully written and does a great job of really summarizing a lot of him in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, I really love it, and for aside from the fact that it's really an effective way to convey this character, at least how Zoid sees him, but it also does play into this concept of like the cop in your head is the phrase. If you don't know what that means, you should look it up. I'm not going to go into it, but that it really does nail that concept at the same time, and I don't know if that's what Pynchon was thinking, but it does.
Well, I think it's unlikely that I'm gonna steal Will's, so I won't force him to go next. If I was to pick, like, and this is an exaggerated definition of quote, if I was to pick like my favorite quote from the book, it would be the extended monologue about their wedding ceremony and their marriage and everything. I just, like I talked about at the top of the show, I think it's just absolutely excellent. But I'm gonna pick one paragraph from that, where it says, "Music was by the Corvairs, these days calling themselves Surfadelic, though the nearest surf at the moment was at Santa Cruz, 40 miles away over farm roads and murderous mountain passes. and they had to contend with the traditional beer rider haughtiness of the area. Still, in later years, try as Zoid might to remember everything at its most negative, truth was there'd been no brawls or barfing or demolition derbies. Everybody had got along magically. It was one of the peak parties of his life. Folks loved the music, and it went on all night and the next, right on through the weekend. Pretty soon, bikers and biker chicks playing at Villainy were showing up in full regalia, and then a hay wagon jammed full of back-to-nature acid heads from up the valley out of an old-fashioned hayride, and eventually the sheriff, who ended up doing the stroll, a dance of his own day with 3 mini-skirted young beauties to a screaming electric arrangement of Pipeline, and who was kind enough not to go near, let alone investigate, the punch, but did accept a can of Bergie, it being a warm day. I really like that paragraph for a number of reasons. One, I think it kind of what we were talking about earlier about Zoid being this kind of hopeless romantic, not just for his relationship with Nessie, but also for like the hippie ideal and the dream of this like perfect future where everyone just sort of gets it, man, and just is just happy to be around each other. Like it's clear that this was sort of an intersection for him of those two things, where it seemed like it was really going to work out for him, and that all of the things that he had been working towards, that fig tree analogy that Will spoke about, really came to head where those two things intersected. This world that he'd created for himself and the woman that he'd ended up loving out of it. The other interesting thing that comes to mind in reading that section that I was reminded of, once again as a connection to Inherent Vice, is specifically the line, pretty soon bikers and biker chicks playing at Villainy were showing up in full regalia, and it says that they were playing at violence, or playing at, something negative, and so it remembers that nothing actually happened. Like there was no fights, there's no brawls. There's a monologue in Inherent Vice where it talks about how Doc is noticing that more and more of these like hippie gatherings, in particular the Spotted Dick party that he goes to, he's been seeing these like older men that are kind of stylized as these biker club members, or these Aryan Brotherhood members, as they are in that book, who are kind of there to sort of break up the countercultural movement, and they were kind of creating a force in response to the counterforce that they realized, and that he'd been noticing these people showing up more and more, and how it seemed to signal to him that the dream was kind of about to end. I think it's very interesting how the opposite imagery, well, the same imagery is invoked here, but it has the opposite end result, and where that kind of points to these two characters in relation to one another, and where their mental states are at. It's a simple paragraph, but there's a lot to unpack there in context of the character, but also just Pynchon's writing as a whole.
Yeah, and the difference in time period there, because this is the flashback to their wedding. I mean, we're talking about 2 years difference between the setting of that scene and Inherent Vice.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, you came really close to stealing mine.
Oh,
okay.
Because I'm going with the 2 paragraphs preceding that.
Okay.
Zoid had grown up in the San Joaquin, ridden with the Bud Warriors and later the Ambassadors, gone on many an immortally lunatic grudge run, as Dick Dale might say, through the pre-suburban citrus groves and pepper fields, lost a high percentage of his classmates, blank rectangles in the yearbooks, to drunk driving or failed machinery, and would eventually return to the same sunny, often he could swear haunted, landscape to get married, one afternoon on a smooth gold-green California hillside, with oak in darker patches of freeway in the distance, dogs and children playing and running, and the sky, for many of the guests, a wriggle with patterns of many colors, some indescribable. For Nessie, Margaret, Zoid, Herbert, will you, for real, in trouble or in trippiness, promise to remain always on the groovy high known as love, and so forth? It may have taken hours or been over in half a minute. There were few if any timepieces among those assembled, and nobody seemed restless, this after all being the mellow 60s, a slower moving time, pre-digital, not yet so cut into pieces, not even by television. It would be easy to remember the day as a soft focus shot, the kind to be seen on sensitivity greeting cards in another few years. Everything in nature, every living being on the hillside that day, strange as it sounded later whenever Zoid tried to tell about it, was gentle at peace. The visible world was a sunlit sheep farm. War in Vietnam, murder as an instrument of American politics, black neighborhoods torched to ashes and death, all must have been off on some other planet. And I don't have anything to dig out of that except that it is entirely engrossing to me. When I read that, I love it. It is a perfect depiction of what's going through Zoid's head at this moment. And that's, like I said, I don't have anything to say about it. It's just beautiful.
It really is.
Yeah, it absolutely is. That was a contender for one of my choices too.
I'm sure, because I considered the one that you chose as well.
Most Pynchon part. Do we have any specific things that stand out there?
Marquis de Sade for me.
Yeah, that's fair. I think mine would be just the pizza restaurant that Prairie works at. Yeah, and just everything that represents.
Mine might be just the brief flashback to Zoid telling Prairie about his astral projections.
Oh, sure.
That just feels like, I don't know who else would dedicate like a paragraph to a weird hypnagogic scene that doesn't have any impact on anything except for, going the extra step to tell you how much Zoid believes in his love.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings us to listener questions and comments, which we actually have more than we've ever had for a single episode, which is really, really awesome. Cody, do you want to start by reading the email that we got?
Sure. So this is kind of a long one, and there's kind of a lot to unpack here. So I'll read through the whole thing, and then we'll kind of go through the different parts of it little by little. So this is an email from Nick. It says, "Hey, so glad you're doing this one. I read it last year and was pleasantly surprised by its warmth and hope, wishful and wobbly as it may be. I ended up writing some criticism about it too, if you're interested. Dazzling symmetries, zero expectations." I'll post a link to his essay in the show notes, so I would please go out and read it. I unfortunately have not had time to read it since Nick sent it over, so Nick, I apologize. I will get on that because I'm very interested in reading it. I know Luke read it and he really liked it, so we'll come back and address it maybe in the next episode. But anyways, Nick goes on to say, "One thing that's always confounded me about Pynchon and something present in Vineland is what you term, quote, zaniness in the episode on chapters 1 and 2. I've never been charmed by anything zany, see also satirical, slapstick, gonzo, etc., in Pynchon's work, in part because the jokes are so self-conscious, more worthy of a cringe or wince than a laugh, in effect magnified by how much Pynchon nerds celebrate and ape this sense of humor. Despite this, I think it might actually be an effective form of critique in the sense that the things meriting parody are usually idiotic themselves, creating a kind of fight fire with fire logic. You can better expose the idiocy by allowing yourself to be idiotic. How does this compare to attempts to laugh at something stupid through a more highbrow approach? Are those critiques doomed to come off as snooty or pretentious? What about a more sober, explicit critique, just saying why the dumb thing is dumb rather than enacting it in a joke's effect? And is critique even the point if Pynchon reserves some joy for the systems he also despises? Is the sugar cereal an opportunity for critique, or can we let it simply be part of the texture of the kinship bond we're witnessing? At a larger, more abstract level, what is Pynchon's relationship to the systems that govern our lives and their representative objects, e.g. sugar cereal? My essay tries to think through this, but I'm not sure where I land on the matter, and I'd be curious to hear you guys tackle these questions. Another request, please excerpt the audiobook guy doing Hector Zuniga's dialogue. I'm just imagining the Foos Gone Wild Joker accent. In a similar vein, I highly recommend sampling William Gibson's reading of Neuromancer. He has this ancient stoner, stuffy-nosed quality to his voice that's distracting and charming in equal measure, and he fearlessly bumbles the Babylonian patois that appears in the book's final third. With appreciation from the home of Oedipus, Nick. So I will just quickly address the audiobook thing. I don't think we can do that because that would probably create some sort of a copyright issue that might get the episode taken down. So if anybody has access to the audiobook, I guess go listen to it, because I can imagine that's got to be something else to hear Hector Zuniga's dialogue. But let's kind of go through these points that Nick brings up.
I think that, and we kind of talked about it a bit last week, I want to say, where we mentioned, like, that's kind of the fun of postmodernism. Is that something that means something deeper, or is that just a thing that's there, right? And I don't think that there is necessarily an answer one way or the other. I think that the best, like, the cleanest mapping that I could make to anything we've already talked about was when you had brought up your supposedly crackpot theory with the music relating to the fake glass, and then I had kind of mentioned, like, the thematic, or not the plot driven aspect of why that's there. They're kind of trying to trap him in this scheme, and then Will very intelligently followed that up by basically saying, like, both of those things are true at once. There is the plot driven aspect of it, and then there's this thematic aspect that relates to the decade and deeper things going on there. I think the same thing could be true to something like Sugar Cereal, for example. Like, is it something that's adding to the texture of the bond that we're witnessing, to use his words? Yeah, absolutely. Could it also be hinting at something else that is either table setting for the decade that the book is written in, or something, more specifically thematic that Pynchon is trying to get at? Absolutely true as well. And because of the fact that a lot of this stuff is not explicitly on the page, whether it's Vineland or Mason and Dixon, or looking at other postmodern authors, the stuff that they've written, it's part of the enjoyment of being able to go through and read these books and kind of dig out what meaning you can pull out of the text. Like, not to get too, like, literary criticism, death of the author, new school on it, but that is part of the enjoyment of reading these books, and part of the reason why this podcast exists as a whole. But I do think that you do run the risk in any event of going far too deep into that, of just like, let's take apart every single sentence and see what he's really trying to get at. Like, you can easily fall down that rabbit hole as well.
Yeah. I would say in response to the zaniness issue, I think you're right on with your idea that it's. I think I have to back this up and say that I think that the zaniness of Pynchon's humor, and not just him, but I think the overall sort of zany comedy requires a very deft hand and a very sharp sense of humor to make it land. If it's overdone, it becomes obnoxious and completely destroys its own purpose. And if it's not strong enough, then you lose the opportunity to satirize what it is you're trying to satirize. And I think, to give an example, I think of each of those two independent situations. When you go too far, you end up with a situation where, like those the spoof movies they did in the late 2000s, where the epic movie and the date movie and all that shit.
Yeah,
that's going too far. Like, that is, you're trying to show how inane and sort of inherently dumb something is by lampooning it, but you're doing it, you're overshooting it so much that no one sees that. They just see you being an idiot even more. The opposite end of that, where you're trying to be zany and satirize something, but you completely miss the point, or not miss the point, but you don't make it zany enough to where the parody is caught, is the Beastie Boys "Fight for Your Right" song and video.
Okay, yeah.
Where they were trying to make fun of that whole frat boy thing in the late 80s, early 90s, but no one got it because they were almost too sincere about it. And so if they had ratcheted up the zaniness a little bit, I think they could have landed that joke, but instead it backfired so badly on them that it just ended up hating almost the entire album. But specifically that song, like, it became a huge thing for them of like, we fucked up and this did not land the way we wanted it to, and everybody missed the point. So I think you have to strike the right balance of that, and I think Pynchon does that. Are there times where it's cringy or I wince? Sure, absolutely. It's never perfect. There are absolutely those kind of situations. But I think, especially in a book like Vineland, when you're trying to show how ridiculous something like the war on drugs was, or the gendered product placement that occurred throughout that time and still occurs, I think it merits that level of zaniness in order for us as a reader, especially those of us who weren't alive at that time or didn't experience that in other countries. Because again, a lot of this is uniquely American. So I think having that level of quote unquote zaniness really helps drive that joke home. And so I think that's ultimately where I land on that.
Okay. I could talk about these questions for hours. I'm not exaggerating. I might.
Oh, I could
be.
too.
No, I mean the question of what the purpose of zaniness in Pynchon's work is something that I've spent way too much time thinking about, and I think the quickest way I can communicate the purpose is by giving homework to everybody and saying to by the next episode, go read V and go read The Recognitions by William Gaddis.
All right.
Read those two books back to back, and you will see the
1,500
purpose.
pages of text.
Yeah, you will see the purpose of Pynchon's zaniness, because it's not necessarily a matter of like too much Zane or too little Zane. What it comes down to is the purpose of the jokes. If you want to look at the Kenosha Kid thing, if you want to look at checks in the mayo, if you want to look at the goofy names, almost always those are used as a way to break the tension of a truly like what in any other author's work would be a darkest hour of the heart scene. They are always or almost always used for the purpose of basically uniting the form of the actual words chosen with the truly absurd aspects of society which he is trying to lampoon, so that you can then later see those atomized elements, those atomized letters and words, as reconfigured into the rest of the story. And that it is something where I hate the jokes. I truly don't like the jokes in Pynchon's books. Some of them I think are fucking hilarious, regardless of the fact that I still find them unsatisfactory as jokes. But the reason I find them funny is because of the degree of effort put into coming to the punchline. And at that point, it stops being comedy within the dichotomy between tragedy and comedy. It has become a meta comedy. It is an anti-humor that has taken the next step of saying, yeah, this is still a joke. It's just a horrible joke, and I'm going to draw in front of you how I came to the conclusion of this joke, so that you have to sit here and see that every part of our lives is full of this kind of insipidity every second of every day. I think that it is both much deeper and much less deep than people usually talk about it. And I think that there is, in terms of his most egregious works, like V, Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, Against the Day, it is, and probably in Bleeding Edge, which again I have not read yet, it comes down to an almost a camouflage element. Not necessarily in the sense that, oh, Pynchon knows these secrets and he'll get arrested if he says this, but more that most people are not going to engage on the level which he needs you to engage on to actually criticize these things. So what he does is he lays these little Easter eggs in the jokes so that they stick around in your mind. And when you come back to the book, you come back to them looking for the jokes. If you like that sense of humor, or if you just find it ridiculous, you at least have that in your mind. And it's something that anchors you to the work as a work, not as a story in some transcendent sense, or as like a work of genius in some like, oh, Pynchon is important kind of way, but as this is a book, this is a joke, you are reading words that are stupid. You understand that, don't you? You are a person reading words. I think that's as much as I'm going to get without going off in very random directions.
I think you've provided a very nice summary.
Sorry, I just wanted to grab the title of that essay. Dazzling Symmetries, the essay from the listener Nick who wrote in. I gave it a first pass over. I haven't fully digested it. I really enjoyed it, but I will just say for anybody who is interested in reading it, don't start it until you've finished reading Vineland, because it does have major spoilers, and it's good. It's a great essay, but yeah, just a heads up.
Yeah, and I think, funny enough, Cody, too, getting to like your point about the really bad like dude bro spoof movies of the early 2000s, you could also say that the other equivalent, not just necessarily the Beastie Boys music video, would be the original spoof movies that inspired those crappy ones in the early 2000s.
Scary Movie was not bad.
But even
everything that came after it,
even going further back to like the Zucker movies, like Naked Gun or Top Secret, and
because it was nuanced. They knew where to stop. And also, I think I want to finish my statement by just saying that I don't necessarily, now that I'm thinking about it more, I don't think zany is the right word. When I hear zany, I think of like the Marx Brothers or Monty Python, where it was like unhinged and there was like almost an anarchy to it. It was chaotic, but controlled enough to not go off the rails. And I mean, some later Monty Python did. That's what I think of as zany. I don't think Pynchon is zany. I certainly think it's over the top at times, and some of the other, slapstick and stuff like that. Sure. I don't know that I don't think zany necessarily is the right word there, but I get what Nick is getting at.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that word would be applied popularly, for sure.
I'd call it zany. Thank you very much.
Will, do you want to read the first Twitter comment we have?
Sure. So this is from @AceSportsBall on Twitter. I'm really enjoying your Mason and Dixon series. I'm like 40 hours in, and each time you mention you can email us, I think I should let them know I'm enjoying it. Thank you. We appreciate it. We even appreciate meta commentary on your own lack of commentary.
Yeah, that's great stuff.
He thought that they should email us, but then decided to hit us up on Twitter.
Yeah.
I just love that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We always appreciate any comments. From Steve Weddle Books on Instagram, they just say, "Love the work y'all are doing." Thank you, Steve. I assume your last name is Weddle, or Books. Maybe is your last name. Maybe Weddle's your middle name.
Books.
Yeah, Steve Weddle. I thank you for the compliment, Steve. Cody, do you want to read the Reddit comment?
Yeah. So, from hold on a second, so I can read. I gotta separate these because my eyes aren't working anymore. Ayanami Dream Sequence on Reddit. Great stuff. We did a group read on Vineland a few years ago on the sub, and I enjoyed digging deeper into it then. Looking forward to what you have to say as we make our way through. And a long overdue, really great job with the podcast, as has been a lot of fun to listen to thus far. Keep fighting the good fight. Thank you. Vineland was one that, we had talked early on about jumping into early, and I'm glad that we did, and I'm glad that we're able to add to the conversation.
Yeah, the desperately needed conversation. I guess everyone was just maybe intimidated by the fact that our emails for Mason and Dixon were all from Brett. They're just like, well, I don't want to really...
Brett has yet to email us, Brett.
Yeah, Brett, why aren't you writing a book on Vineland, too?
Yeah, we need it.
Didn't we posit that we would be writing the book
I
on
think
Vineland
so,
last
yeah.
episode?
Yeah.
You know,
Never mind. Brad, don't take our money. We need it. We got that cheese money.
I'm sure there's so much money in
There's
in writing a Vineland companion.
Vineland companion books,
I
yeah.
am confident in it.
Our Tillamook money's not going to cover all of our expenses.
Well, we also have the Aspic money.
Big aspic money. No, Will's hoarding all that.
All $5 a month.
And then Will, do you want to read our last Reddit comment?
Sure. And this is from NN_NN, which I imagine is supposed to be a blinking or
An
grinning
ASCII
face.
art.
Loving the 80s synth pop discussion, haha. And as somebody who was not a big part of the 80s synth pop discussion, I can say it was enjoyable to listen to. So, yeah. I can.
Yeah. Everybody listened to 80s synth pop. It was a genre I slept on for way too long in my life before I finally listened to some of it.
And once you
And
get done with that, then you can move on to Talk's good music.
I should clarify that my comments on the sterilized music, what I was referring to specifically was more of the power rock, I guess, that was coming up, that was losing its edge. Synth pop, I do have a soft spot for, and it is also a genre that I somewhat more recently got into. But soft cell, I did do my homework. Kate, I did listen to some soft cell.
Yeah.
I was enjoying it. There was some good stuff in there.
Yeah.
There was a lot of there. So I have, my kids have overheard my wife and I at times talk about how the 80s was just a bizarre, weird time in which there was not much redemptive that came out of it. That's not true. There was really, truly a lot of awesome music and film and art in general that came out of the 80s. So
Yes.
don't dismiss everything that came out of there, because there's really a lot of really cool stuff. I just had a problem with what was super popular at the time, and was pushing itself up into the kind of mainstream of the culture. But the underground music of the 80s, absolutely choice stuff.
Yeah. Also, now that you've listened to Soft Cell, you should listen to A Flock of Seagulls' self-titled record.
That's a legitimately good album.
It is.
Like,
It is
I
a
have
legitimately
heard that
good
album.
album.
Yeah.
That is a band that was unfairly maligned for their hair,
Yep.
mostly.
Well, fairly maligned for their hair, I think.
Well,
Yeah, it does.
that has no bearing on the quality of the music they were
It doesn't.
recording.
I'm not
But it
saying
does
it
look
does.
like they're wearing a helmet backwards.
Yep.
But like, everybody's heard the major single off of that record, I Ran So Far Away. But like, the rest of that album is amazing, like from front to back.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that should be maybe a new segment we have on here, because we couldn't really do it with Mason and Dixon, but we can with this, of like an album that it should be like listener homework. Like, go listen to this album or go listen to this band that kind of defined part of the 80s.
Yeah, there you go. So last week was Soft Cell. This week is A Flock of Seagulls.
Flock of Seagulls. Yeah, I'll throw in. Go listen to some Sonic Youth. 80s Sonic Youth. That's some really good stuff.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Looking up what album Swans released in '84.
Oh,
Okay.
is great. Yeah.
Just to be a counterpoint to the synth pop.
Yeah, the noisiest abrasive music possible.
Would that have been soundtrack
Cop.
for the deaf?
No, that's Cop. Yeah, don't listen to Cop. Never mind, I take it back.
Never mind, I take it. You could listen to Killing Joke.
Oh, good. Yeah.
That would be a bit of a harder edged, but still very 80s band.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll throw out one good punk, 80s punk. Go listen to Husker Du.
Yeah, there you go.
If you want some fast ass, loud ass music, Husker Du will absolutely scratch that itch.
Yeah, that's a good one. From a metal perspective, I gotta.
You could go the easy thrash metal of, like Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth.
Yeah,
that's a little too easy though.
That would be lame. I'd say like maybe Napalm Death.
What else? I have to really search my mind right now for.
Napalm Death. Like if you want to talk about like death metal, like Morbid Angel, or just Death.
Ooh.
Death is freaking Scream Bloody Gore is such a good record. I could listen to that album like any day of the week. Same with Leprosy. You can't really go wrong with any of Death's records, really. Like they're all good. Individual Thought Patterns is the record they made when they were kind of like, man, we don't really have to sing about like pestilence and like death. We can sing about other stuff. But yeah, like anything by Death is really good. Yeah, Morbid Angel, it's amazing. Yeah, there's a lot of really great 80s metal stuff. But those would be my recommendations in that direction.
All right. Well, there you go. Go do your homework, folks, and let us know what you think of all that.
Read the recognitions. Also read
the
V.
recognitions and V.
Yep. Listen to a Flock of Seagulls. All of Sonic Youth's 80s output.
Don't
you can skip swans. You can skip the first Sonic Youth. I start with Bad Moon Rising, maybe.
That's a fair place to start with Sonic Youth, yeah. What else do we say? Yeah, listen to Napalm Death. The self-titled's really good. Listen to Scream Bloody Gore.
Go get Zen Arcade, arguably the greatest double album ever made.
I can't agree with that assessment, but it's a great
I said record. I said arguably. I could probably, if I could think of more for sure. Best punk double album, because there's only like 2 of those.
Yeah, that's fair.
I didn't even know about Confusion is Sex.
It's okay. I will say this: Brother James on that album is good. It's their like live best song. I absolutely love that song live. But Confusion is Sex as a whole, honestly, like as much as I love Sonic Youth, and they're like one of my favorite bands, they really, when Steve Shelley joined the band, is when they really got their feet on the ground.
That's true. In case none of our listeners knew, we could also just do a music podcast.
We could just talk about music for another few hours, sure.
But I think we should probably call it for this episode. Yeah. All right, I think that'll do it for us this week. We'll see you guys next week when we come back and cover chapters 5 through 6.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Okay, so quick story here, because this is my brain again.
Yeah.
2 years ago? Yeah, 2 years ago. My son got invited to a birthday party. And so I took him, and this was, ironically enough, this was also the same day I took him to see Built to Spill. So I was really looking forward to that. But I wasn't looking forward to going to a birthday party because I don't like other parents. So we get to this kid's house, and he immediately, he runs off with his friends. It's whatever. Normally in these kind of situations, my wife is with me, and I have that grounding. I have a person there that I like spending time with, and that keeps me from being anxious and awkward. She wasn't there. So I'm just like shuffling around. I know none of these people. I don't know what to do. So I'm just like aimlessly wandering around. And then at some point, this kid's dad comes over. He's like, hey, we're hanging out in my man cave. Do you want to come? And as soon as the words man cave left his mouth, I was like, I don't know what else to do. So we go into what it literally is a converted shed. That had, just concrete floor. There legitimately was a Fight Club poster was the first thing I saw when I walked in there. And there was a Scarface poster, a Boondock Saints poster, and I don't remember there was a couple more like UFC something or others. And I'm just like, this is the worst. And they're playing darts on like one of those cheap electronic dartboards, and he had it was probably like Bud Light on tap, which I quit drinking years ago, so that didn't mean anything to me. But he also had
it should mean something to you.
It means something when other people are drinking it. Yeah. He had a YouTube playlist on this like a TV the size of my computer monitor that was wall mounted for whatever reason. And it was playing like Kid Rock and Red Hot Chili Peppers and Matchbox 20. And it was just, like I was stuck in there for an inordinate amount of time because I didn't know what else to do. And I was like, if I leave, these guys are gonna like get mad at me and want to fight me because that's what they do. I don't know. And so I'm like nervously checking my phone every couple of minutes, like, is it time? Can I just say we have to go? And so finally I was just like, I can't do this anymore. This is so surreal and weird. I have to leave. So I just grabbed my son. I was like, we're gonna go downtown and eat before the show. It's like 3:00 in the afternoon.
That's amazing.
Oh,
Oh,
It was-
wow.
it was
That's like-
otherworldly.
It's like the most stereotypical man cave I've
It was-
ever.
A Boondock Saints poster, man.
Yeah.
That's the cherry.
Yeah. I wanted to get pictures of it. I was like, I know if I try to take pictures, they're gonna ask what I'm doing. And I
Oh, dude.
can't explain my
You
way out
should
of
have
that.
said, I'm.
You should have said,
I
like, I
love how
need
you set this up.
inspiration. Yeah.
I'm putting it on my inspo board.
I'm gonna tell my wife what's up, and I'm gonna make her let me have a man cave.
Oh, God.
I'm
I
gonna
feel
go
like
to Home Depot right now.
I feel like if someone were to just use the phrase man cave, like that would be the image that most
Yeah.
people would have in
Yes.
their mind.
That's the Shutterstock image of man
Exactly.
cave.
Yes.
I mean, like a bowl of loose nuts, maybe.
Oh.